That's right. It's time once again to activate the famed Anomatron 6000, our patented machine that definitely wasn't developed in affiliation with Dr. Wondertainment. We swear. After recalibrating, rebooting, and hitting restart, our infamous specialized supercomputer is ready to bring you all manner of improbable scenarios. We'll simulate encounters between the SCP Foundation's various anomalies and any other character from any other universe you could possibly imagine. Here's a question for you. What do you think would happen if SCP-096, the notorious Shy Guy, ran afoul of someone he couldn't just kill for daring to look at it? What if the Scourge of the Underworld, Battler of Demons, and the Devil himself set his sights on SCP-096? Well, we're about to hit the button and discover the outcome of SCP-096 versus the dreaded Doomslayer. So you've heard the old philosophical debate about a tree falling down in the woods, and whether or not nobody being around to hear it brings into question if it actually happened at all, right? Well, let's reframe that one a little. If an interdimensional rip in the very fabric of the time-space continuum opens up in an SCP Foundation secure facility and nobody is around to witness it, does a 6-foot-tall, 360-pound hulking killing machine still emerge to slaughter everything in his path? It turns out, yes, he definitely does. Horrified screams and the loud bang of shotgun blasts rang out through the hallway as Foundation researchers ran for their lives. The Doom Marine had just been unceremoniously dropped out of a portal into a strange and unfamiliar environment. Mere minutes earlier, he had been awakened inside a sarcophagus within a facility on Mars in the year 2148. Unfortunately, Doom Guy hadn't had the best start to his day, given that the base he'd woken up in was being overrun by the forces of hell itself, thanks to a rogue scientist opening up portals to the underworld and allowing all manner of demonic abominations to come pouring through. So naturally, when another portal brought the armor-clad Demon Slayer to a site run by the SCP Foundation, the intensity of battle had led to the Doomslayer believing that the unsuspecting staff were actually all demons in disguise. And to him, the only good demon is one he got to send back to hell in the most brutal fashion imaginable. He wasn't going to stop until he'd torn through wave after wave of Foundation personnel, thinking perhaps if he killed enough, he'd be returned to his previous locale for more demon killing. As the Foundation dispatched its security forces and mobile task forces to take down the unstoppable force of carnage decked out in head-to-toe green armor, it seemed nothing they could throw at the Doom Marine was enough to take him down. A hail of bullets rained down on him from the MTF's weapons, ricocheting ineffectually off his protective plating as he continued his assault, remaining tireless thanks to his immense physical conditioning. The SCP Foundation tried and failed to contain Doom Guy. They assumed him to either be a new, undocumented anomaly or a violent and unhinged maniac from the Church of the Broken God, given his armor resembling cybernetic augmentations and machine parts grafted to his body, along with his arsenal of advanced weaponry. But there were no enhancements, no augmentations made to the Doomslayer. He may have once been mortal, but centuries of killing demons had allowed him to transcend ordinary human physiology. He did not tire, never lost strength, never needed to eat or drink, and was near enough immortal. Yet among all the chaos that was unfurling, a solitary researcher had just managed to slip out of the Doomslayer's reach. He ran as fast and far as he was physically able. The mobile task force troops were getting eviscerated, and the Slayer could easily tear through the whole Foundation. Then, fleeing for his life, the researcher had an idea, either a stroke of genius or total idiocy, and a risky move either way. He would send an anomaly on the Doomslayer. He turned to the nearest containment cell, a windowless room with a heavy locked door. Hurriedly inputting his security clearance code, the researcher heaved the door open and covered his eyes with his arm. It wouldn't have been his first choice of SCP to send into battle. SCP-096’s cell was the closest. Lumbering out of its containment chamber on its misshapen, elongated legs, SCP-096 scanned the area. Alarms were blaring. It was loud and frightening to the timid, albeit terrifying creature. It reached up to cover its ears in bewilderment. Not that the researcher who had freed it could see what it was doing. For one, his eyes were still covered, and for another, he was already dead, thanks to the Doomslayer barging shoulder first through a nearby wall and raining debris onto the nearby researcher. Beneath the visor of his helmet, the Marine breathed heavily, panting but not tiring, as he looked at the pale, skinny creature in the corridor before him. It was clutching the sides of its head. Its huge jaw hung open. As far as the Slayer knew, he was making progress. His attack was working. He'd killed enough of these demonic imposters that they were starting to reveal their true forms. Although in all his years of bloodshed and being a scourge to the denizens of hell, he hadn't quite ever seen a demon that looked like the Shy Guy. Not that it mattered to Doomguy. Before long, it'd be dead like all the rest. The towering, stick-thin creature turned to face the armor-adorned warrior and shrieked, immediately overcome with anguish, having a full-blown breakdown as it often did whenever someone looked at it. As the demon killer stomped down the corridor towards it, the Doomblade, a long, sleek, razor-sharp edge extended from the Slayer's gauntlet where it was mounted on his wrist. He reached down and yanked the ripcord on his chainsaw too. He was long overdue for a glory kill. But before he could strike at SCP-096, the Shy Guy moved with impossible speed, faster than even the Doom Marine himself. It zipped behind the encroaching Marine, moving quicker than he could perceive. 1 second SCP-096 was crying and wailing in front of him, then not even a full second later, the creature was towering over Doomguy from behind. SCP-096 gripped the Doomblade and snapped it with ease, like breaking a twig before reaching its other long arm down and pulling the chainsaw from Doomguy's hand. The motorized blade was still running as it clattered to the ground, cutting a hole through the floor and falling down into the lower level of the facility. Enraged, as he very often was, the Doomslayer reached both arms back behind his head and gripped the elongated torso of SCP-096. The virtually immortal killing machine hurled the creature over his head with ease, thanks of course to his immense strength. Doomguy could lift objects far heavier than most ordinary humans, and carry heavy weapons without tiring. He had even grappled hand-to-hand with demons. Throwing the Shy Guy down the corridor like hurling a basketball was no trouble for the spacefaring slaughterer of Satan's spawn. Screaming and howling in pain, SCP-096 crashed to the ground at the far end of the corridor, tumbling over itself thanks to its long limbs before landing in a confused heap. As the Shy Guy reoriented itself, struggling back onto its feet and standing up at its full height, it was instantly knocked back down as the force of something struck it. Bearing down on SCP-096, the Doom Machine charged, his signature double-barreled sawed-off shotgun drawn. It was hardly leaving a scratch on SCP-096's pale skin, despite the moderate amount of damage the weapon was capable of. 2 shots would ring out, reeling the creature but not harming it. Then, by the time SCP-096 managed to recover from the blast, the Slayer had finished reloading in time to open fire yet again, even as the Doomslayer raced nearer, closing the distance between him and what he thought to be another demon for him to kill. The shotgun seemed to have little effect against the Shy Guy at close range. Stowing the weapon, Doomguy put all of his focus and energy into his charge, heavy boots stomping against the ground as he raced towards the Shy Guy, still stunned by the latest shotgun blast. Before the creature could steady itself, this time it was struck by another force, a heavy object barreling towards it. The Doomslayer shoulder barged SCP-096, sending the pair of them crashing through the nearest wall. They burst into a neighboring room, with the Doomslayer keeping a single-armed grip around the Shy Guy, while repeatedly delivering vicious punches to its gut with his other hand, not once relenting. SCP-096 screeched in pain, clawing at the Slayer, but unable to tear through his impenetrable armor. As they crashed through yet another wall, SCP-096 did something it rarely ever did. In fact, maybe something it had never ever done before. It ran away from someone that had looked at it. While the creature was deeply insecure and so self-conscious that it would kill anyone who saw so much as a photograph of it, it didn't often feel afraid. But the Doomslayer, this muscle-bound killing machine that had brutally butchered actual demons, was so imposing, so threatening, and so effective at dispensing painful punishment that he scared the fight out of SCP-096. Sobbing with terror, the creature zipped away using its anomalous speed, trying desperately to put as much distance between it and the Doom Marine as it possibly could. But therein lay the problem. No sooner had SCP-096 gotten away from the Scourge of Hell than the creature immediately felt the familiar pull. Whether it was an inescapable compulsion to kill everyone who looked at it, or the fact of the Shy Guy's biology, it could only distance itself from the Slayer for a few seconds before it reappeared next to him. From the Doom Guy's perspective, it seemed like the creature was intentionally disappearing and reappearing, using its teleportation-like speed to evade a volley of his attacks. SCP-096 came at him again, stuck in a loop of trying to attack the Doomslayer for looking at it, to immediately regretting that course of action and fleeing in fear of its hulking, heavy weapon-toting target. Doom Guy drew every weapon he had in his arsenal, launching a barrage of high-explosive ordnance from his rocket launcher to try and kill SCP-096. The resulting damage practically reduced an entire wing of the Foundation site to rubble, but still couldn't kill the Slayer's opponent. Meanwhile, in the moments that the Shy Guy temporarily forgot his own fear for the Doom Guy, it managed to rush towards him, swiping the Marine's various technologically advanced armaments out of his hands, before instantly remembering why he was so scared of the green armored force of destruction and dashing away. Doom Guy's supply of weapons had all but depleted. Neither he nor SCP-096 were getting tired out by their constant back and forth. They were locked in a stalemate, until the Shy Guy tried to get back to its cell. Zipping away once again, it cowered in the corner, reaching for an old worn-out paper bag that had slipped over its head. It sat down, trembling, rocking back and forth in a fetal position. The Shy Guy was terrified. An overwhelming, debilitating fear gripped it. Fear that became pure dread as the sound of heavy boots began to stomp closer and closer. Kicking the steel door off its hinges, the Doomslayer walked into SCP-096's cell, carrying something huge in his hands. It was one of the most devastating weapons Doom Guy had at his disposal, capable of unleashing untold destruction, the BFG 9000. Without remorse, not caring that the creature seemed to have retreated and was cowering away from him, the Slayer raised the powerful weapon and fired an enormous ball of green energy. The blast engulfed the entire room, tendrils snaking out from the energy projectile, causing additional damage to the surrounding area until there was nothing left of SCP-096. As you walk down the halls of the SCP Foundation Site-19, peeking in the various windows at the anomalies contained there, you might catch a glimpse of a dark figure bent over a table, tinkering away like an artisan in his workshop. A vintage black apothecary bag sits next to him, open, and if you stop and watch for a while, you'll see him pull all manner of tools out of it. Impossibly large tools, things that shouldn't fit in such a small bag. A bone saw, an IV stand, jars of fluorescent liquids, and needles the length of your forearm. You shouldn't be surprised. This is a place for impossible things, after all. Still, it's a curious sight. The shadowy man working so diligently, so quietly, focused singularly on his craft, whatever that might be. Only one thing could distract him from his efforts: you. He feels your gaze on him, and he looks up, dark eyes glittering from behind a beaked ceramic mask. He reminds you of an illustration you once saw in a book about the Black Death, the gear the plague doctors wore while treating patients on their deathbeds. "Hello." He greets you in a friendly, heavily accented voice. His eyes crinkle beneath the mask, and if you could see his mouth, you know he'd be smiling. "How are you today, dear fellow? Are you feeling quite well?" He takes a step toward the window, stretching out one gloved hand, and you suddenly realize that you can't see where the mask ends and his skin begins. It's not a mask, but a part of his face. This is no ordinary man. "Do you require help? I can examine you," he offers, palm pressed flat against the glass. A chill runs up your spine, and you realize that you should definitely not take him up on his offer. No matter how friendly he seems, how good his intentions may be, you wouldn't want to let the plague doctor treat you. He sat in his containment cell, fidgeting with his favorite scalpel. He dragged it over the surface of his work table, back and forth, listening to the sound it made. They had tried to confiscate his table, his tools. The guards had quickly learned that he had more of them in his bag. They tried to take away his bag from him, but well, that didn't go over too well for anyone involved. So he was allowed to keep it, to fashion himself a makeshift laboratory in his lonely little cell. There was a time where they had given him test subjects, fresh corpses from the morgue for him to dissect and research. There was a time when the doctors here would come to speak with him, talking of cryptobiology and the pestilence he had dedicated himself to fighting. Those days were long gone. He had hidden away pieces of the corpses, tissue samples in jars of formaldehyde he could pull out when the monotony became too much. But the days of fresh materials, of enlightened discourse with other men and women of science, were over. How he missed those days. The chance to work with others as he once had. What had he done wrong? All he did was treat the sick. Sure, they didn't always understand their illness, didn't want to receive their medicine, but that wasn't a choice for the patient to make. That should have been up to the physician. Perhaps they didn't trust his expertise, didn't see how his work served the greater good, like those who watched Jonas Salk invent the polio vaccine, or Louis Pasteur rid milk of bacteria. They were confused by the advanced scientific practices and feared that which they did not understand. He could forgive them for their ignorance. He was magnanimous that way. If only they would let him out of this infernal room, he could prove his work's worth to them. He could cure them all, begin a new era of wellness and peace worldwide. He didn't exactly sleep, but when he rested on his little cot in the corner of the room, he dreamed of that future, of a world healed by his touch. A knock at the door stirred him from his reverie. Someone was at the door of his containment cell. He glanced at the little window and saw a guard there with a tray of food. He greeted the man with an enthusiastic wave. Sustenance. He didn't require the food for survival, of course, but it helped his mind work more efficiently. It reminded him of a time before these fluorescent lights and these same four walls, of crusty bread with fresh butter by the banks of the Seine. The little slot opened in the door and the tray was shoved through. There was bread, just as he hoped, a small dish of butter, a pot of jam, and a cup of tea still steaming. He picked up the cup at first, taking a deep breath. Ah, an herbal blend with fresh lavender. Lovely. He couldn't see the guard through the window anymore, but he called out to him just the same. "Thank you for the libations." He still had his manners after all, even in confinement. He wished he could have gotten a better look at the man, seen the pallor of his complexion, a tremor in his hand. He thought he had spotted sweat beading on his forehead. Could he be ill? The case required further examination to be certain. He sighed, clutching the cup of tea tighter in frustration. Why wouldn't they just let him work? Why must they scream at the sight of his efforts, flee from his instruments? It didn't seem fair. Still, the pursuit of science rarely was a glamorous one. He had learned as much over the centuries. One day, though, history would look back on him kindly. Of this, he could be certain. He was just settling in and beginning to spread butter across the admittedly stale bread when a horrible sound shook him to attention. He had heard the noise before, though he had never seen its source. It was an ear-splitting scream, a wail of pure agony, like the sound of a wounded wild animal. He had heard many screams during his life, from patients and those who stood in the way of his work, but until he had been brought into custody of the Foundation, he had never heard a scream quite like this one. It was pure rage, devastation, and suffering mixed together, wet with tears, and loud enough to rip through human vocal folds. Whatever was crying out, it was no mere man. More screams answered it, and these were very much human. These sounds were more familiar to him, shrieks of pain, of fear, of desperate but futile attempts to escape, then the meaty thud of bodies falling to the floor, of torn-off limbs hitting walls and windows, a loud crash, and the sound of something large moving quite quickly through the halls. Scientific curiosity got the better of the doctor, and he found himself moving back to his little window, face pressed to the glass so hard his beak nearly cracked it. He couldn't see much of anything, just guards running down the hall, weapons drawn. He saw one of them fire, heard the gunshot ring out. But what was he firing at? Then he saw it, a pale blur darting past the door. Whatever it was, it didn't so much as flinch when the bullet ricocheted off its skin. A long, thin arm crashed against the door, knocking the doctor backwards into his work table. He steadied himself and climbed back to his feet, taking in the damage done to the door. It was crumpled in on itself, nearly ripped off the hinges, and whatever had plowed into it was already gone. From the sounds of chaos in the distance, it had disappeared around the corner, with the guards following it. He inspected the ruins of the door to his containment cell. It was useless now, hanging loose and open. Well, that was an invitation he was hardly about to decline. He grabbed his trusty bag, tossed his scalpel back inside, and set off to see what all the commotion was. It was easy enough to follow the trail of blood, stark and vivid red against the white tile floor, and the sound of gunfire, human screams, and that loud, long, painful wail he had heard before. He walked at a leisurely pace, taking his time, until the sound suddenly stopped. He rounded the corner and found a mound of bodies, guards and scientists, beaten and bloodied, almost beyond recognition. It was quiet here, save for one sound, the sound of weeping. There in the corner, huddled over with its face to the wall, was a pale, thin figure, its shoulders heaving with the force of its sobs. This poor soul was clearly in great distress. It was a peculiar sight, hairless and white, distended arms wrapped around itself as it cried.
"Excuse me,"
the doctor cried out to the pitiful creature.
"Are you all right? Do you need assistance?"
It didn't answer. It just continued to cry. Had something so despondent been responsible for this destruction? The dozens of corpses, the smashed-in walls, the crumbled doors and shattered windows. It seemed impossible. Sure, it was large and looked strong, but he had never seen a monster cry before. This couldn't be a dangerous creature, not when it was so sad. He would help it, but first, he would attend to some of these bodies. He sat his bag on the ground and pulled out several vials of liquid, a set of syringes, and a variety of other surgical tools he might need. Now, after such a long hiatus, he could resume his work in a meaningful way. He couldn't be certain how long he worked, reviving these poor souls and reconstructing their bodies as the pale creature wept in the corner. The sobbing faded into the background for a while, becoming a kind of white noise as he removed a liver here, placed it in a chest cavity there, poked and prodded, injected and extracted, testing out new methods alongside tried and true cures. One by one, the milky eyes fluttered open, rigor mortis stiff joints creaked into motion, sallow faces looking at his with the vacant gratitude he saw in so many patients over the years. He didn't need to thank him with their words. The work was its own reward. He expected more guards to arrive, to attempt to contain the situation, but none came, even as the alarm blared overhead. As for the morose creature, it didn't seem to notice his presence at all, not even when he had brought all of the intact corpses back to life. The patient shuffled around the room aimlessly, waiting for orders of some kind. The doctor tapped one on the shoulder and handed the reborn man a vial of thick, black medicine.
"Give this to the poor fellow in the corner, please."
It wasn't much, but it should calm him, provide some relief from his suffering. The corpse nodded, mouth hanging loose and open, an eyeball dangling unseeing from the socket. He shuffled over to the strange creature and held out the vial to it. It turned, lifting its head, and as it locked eyes with the cured patient, something shifted in its face. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and it shrieked, that same terrible sound as before. Tears streamed from its colorless eyes, its arms shaking with unbridled rage as its jaws locked around the patient's head. Like a boa constrictor, in one fluid motion it swallowed the revived man whole, while the doctor watched in shock. He had been wrong. This was not an innocent creature caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This creature, whatever it was deeply sick. He had never seen such an advanced, aggressive case of the pestilence. He'd heard rumors, of course, but never encountered it firsthand. As a doctor, he had sworn to do no harm, but in a drastic situation, drastic measures have to be taken. It was well known by himself and the doctors at this foundation that he could cause any and all biological functions in an organism to cease with a single touch. And so he approached the creature, arm outstretched, ready to administer that necessary touch to protect the rest of his patients. As he approached, the creature turned to him, its eyes wide and blank, an endless stream of tears pouring from them, spilling onto the floor. It shrieked again, mouth stretching wide enough to engulf his entire head, and ran toward him at a breakneck speed.
I am so sorry you are not well,
the doctor said simply, as his hand pressed to the creature's chest. As soon as the tough hide of the doctor's hand, which the uninformed might mistake for gloves, made contact with the unpigmented skin of the beast, its eyes closed, its muscles went slack, and it collapsed to the ground with a mighty thud. The doctor paced around the fallen creature, taking in the sight. Then something strange caught his eye. The creature's chest still rose and fell. Was it his imagination? He checked its pulse and thought it was slow and faint. And though it was slow and faint, it was very much present. The creature was still alive. It had merely been rendered unconscious by his touch, rather than completely deceased.
Curious. Very curious indeed,
he muttered. Perhaps there were comorbidities present, other infections aside from the pestilence, which rendered the creature unnaturally strong, resilient to the usual courses of treatment. What would cause these abilities? This intense aggression? It seemed to be brought on whenever someone looked at the entity's face. If only he studied psychology more, the science of the mind and its inner workings. Since he had no experience with therapy, nor was he certain this creature could communicate using language at all, there was only one way to find out more about how this creature's brain worked. He would have to take it apart and see for himself. It was slow work, getting the massive creature back to the doctor's containment cell. He required the help of his cured patients, who grasped it by its massive limbs and dragged the limp body through the halls. Once back in a familiar environment, his work table ready and waiting, the doctor instructed his assistants to place the new patient on the table. It was a bit small, unable to accommodate the creature's distended limbs, but if he attempted to use an official Foundation laboratory, he risked discovery and subsequent interruption. So it would have to suffice. First, he set up an IV stand, filled with a vivid green liquid. It was easy to find a vein. The creature's skin was nearly translucent. Now that he could be certain the creature would not wake during surgery, he could make the first incision.
Scalpel.
He held out a hand, and his favorite surgical blade was placed in it by one of the helpful patients.
Thank you.
He slid the scalpel along the hairline of the creature, or where the hairline would be if it weren't completely bald. Once the scalp was removed, he set it aside for later, when it could be reattached.
Bone saw, please.
He held out his hand again, and again his assistant gave him the proper tool. This, however, was when things got strange. The doctor had always been a deft hand at cutting. He'd once even received tutelage from the great Robert Liston, but no matter how hard he tried to saw, it never left a scratch on the creature's skeleton. Naturally, this was somewhat frustrating. He wanted to study the creature's brain tissue, to get a sense for what was going up there neurologically, and he couldn't do that if it was impossible to saw off the creature's cranial cap. He blunted 2 of his favorite saws while trying. Thankfully, there was still a solution to access the beast's gray matter, a little trick he'd learned while studying the funerary practices of the ancient Egyptians. He produced a long, curved hook from his bag and inserted it up the creature's nasal passage. With some fine maneuvering, he eventually managed to remove the brain. It was such a terrible shame that he needed to do it piece by piece via the nasal passage, but one makes do. All that was left was to sew the skin of the creature's head back into place. He was mid-stitch when a voice interrupted his careful work, nearly making him drop the needle.
Hey, what are you doing?
He looked up to find a guard, aiming a gun at his face.
Excuse me, I am in surgery at the moment. Please do not interrupt.
He admonished the guard, but the man did not listen or lower his weapon. In fact, he shouted something into the radio, code words the doctor didn't recognize. Then he fired a bullet into the skull of the patient standing at his side.
How dare you?
The doctor cried, readying himself to confront the guard. but it was too late. Dozens of other guards were swarming the room and neutralizing his assistants. Some in hazmat suits grabbed his arms and pulled him away from the creature on the operating table, no matter how hard he fought or how loudly he protested. Then, something incredible happened. Something wonderful. The creature opened its eyes and sat up. It looked directly at the guard closest to it, and the two saw one another's faces. The guard tensed, preparing for the worst, but nothing came. The creature simply stared, placid and quiet. No screaming, no tearing at flesh, no mouth opening wider and wider to swallow the man whole.
I did it!
The doctor shouted, overcome with elation.
I've cured you! Now begins the rest of your happy life.
He watched as the guards led the shockingly calm creature away, back to its containment cell. The doctor's door was repaired, and he was returned to his state of captivity, but he never forgot the patient he helped that day, and how marvelous it felt to do such a good deed. Meanwhile, SCP-096’s brain regrew within the hour, and caused another massive containment breach, murdering a variety of researchers and guards. But the staff agreed not to tell SCP-049 about any of this. Better to just let him have this one. He really seemed like he needed a win. A very strange anomaly sits in a humanoid containment cell in the minimum security wing of Site-17. He walks, talks, and looks like a man, but everything else is convoluted in a question mark. This is SCP-343, who, like his namesake, God, is likely to cause arguments whenever he's brought up. Is he the creator of all that exists? The basis for the Abrahamic faiths? Or is he a pretender, a reality warper with immense power and predilection towards delusion, a courtesian of the house of Maladrog, Matthew, Methuselah, Yahweh? Who knows? Really, it depends on who you ask, and which stories you choose to believe. And few people enjoy a good story more than SCP-343 himself. If one day you take the time to visit him in his room and ask him to reveal a page in the long book of his personal history, he might be kind enough to tell you a story. A story like this, of an encounter with something monstrous that few others could hope to survive meeting face to face. Rewind a few thousand years. Nobody knows how many exactly. God, as he chooses to dub himself, walked across the cracked ground on worn sandals. It'd been some time since he'd seen an animal around here, and even longer since he'd seen a human being. Not that this bothered him. He'd never been bothered by his own company on a long walk like this. Of course, he could have sped up time or teleported, but where was the fun in that? He was a tourist in the world of sensation, of experience, of flesh, bone, dirt, blood, and sand. After all, where's the fun in creating a whole universe if you can't drop in now and then to visit and do as the Romans do? Not that the Romans would be around for another few thousand years. Even Atlas must occasionally shift the weight of the globe from his shoulders for a jaunt around the cosmic neighborhood, and whatever passes for fresh air in the vacuum. God whistled a tune to himself. It was a craggy, mountainous region he'd found himself in. The distant peaks had frosted caps, a breathtaking place where many truly had their breaths taken away. How humans will so happily risk their lives to do something extraordinary. It never ceased to amaze him. His stomach rumbled. Oh, how he enjoyed that sensation. One of the funny little quirks of this human form that he weaved for himself. It was no reason to be concerned, if memory served, from his last trip through the area a few decades before. There was a friendly village not far from here. They had always accepted him as a genial stranger, having no knowledge of his true power. God had always believed that a person's goodness is defined by how they treat those from whom they had nothing to gain. So it caused him great concern as he approached the village and saw great plumes of smoke rising into the sky. He was so shocked by this that he could decide to break his rule about walking as a man, in case there was still some way he could help. With a snap of his fingers, he disappeared and reappeared in the center of the village's town square. Total devastation. Huts and houses had been torn asunder. Broken weapons lay on the ground. Some places were on fire, others smeared with streaks of blood, like some terrible battle had occurred here. But something was wrong. No bodies, not one, from defender or assailant. How could a thriving village be so thoroughly destroyed and not leave a single corpse? It was an act so bizarre and depraved that it left even God puzzling. That was another downside of his human form. Here on Earth, he didn't have access to true omniscience. How could a mere human mind, bound by the constraints of linear time, ever truly comprehend the total of existence? Even attempting to do that here would melt the brain of his human body in its skull and leave it dribbling out of his nose and ears. Instead, he chose to walk around the ruins of the village and investigate firsthand. Arrows and broken spears and swords littered the ground. Some buildings were demolished, but there were no tracks or stray projectiles that could suggest the presence of siege weapons. No, these buildings looked like they were ripped apart. Some even still had claw marks. What terrible beast could have set upon this town and done this? Then he heard a voice, quiet and pleading beneath some nearby rubble. A survivor. He rushed over to the pile and evaporated it with a thought. Underneath, a feeble old man, covered in stone dust, was quivering. God helped him up and guided him into one of the few remaining huts still standing in the village. They both took seats. God held up 2 hands, cradling empty space. 2 cups suddenly occupied that space, both filled with warm, healing tea. He passed the old man one of the cups while sipping from his own. He asked the old man if he'd seen what had happened. The old man told him no, he hadn't seen anything in decades. He'd been rendered blind in his youth. Little did either of them know that very blindness was the only reason he was the sole survivor of the massacre. The blind man told God that one of the village's scouts had gone up into the mountain with a small hunting party. The group was gone for days, until one of the members, the youngest among them, returned weeping, frostbitten, and covered in blood. He said that his friends had been killed by a beast in the mountains, something that almost looked like a man, but terribly wrong. And its face, its awful, awful face. He would never forget it. He was just lucky to escape with his life when the others were torn apart. But when the young man returned, he'd brought the shadow of death with him. It was a curse that doomed the entire village, men, women, and children, to a terrible fate. And that fate was upon them a mere hour after the survivor had returned. Of course, there were gaps in the blind man's understanding, given he was lacking one of his major senses, but the sounds he could describe with perfect clarity. It was faint and distant at first, that awful wail, and the galloping, hands and feet thundering against the ground faster than any horse could move, getting closer and closer. Another villager saw it approaching and screamed. Then it was upon them. The villager screamed, but it screamed louder, always wailing and shrieking and sobbing like a monster crawling straight up from hell. People tried to fight it by the sounds of it. The blind man, with teary, blank eyes, recalled the sounds of arrows knocking and swords clashing against something. But even their greatest warriors had screamed and died. Those who saw it and tried to flee and hide were slaughtered all the same. Soon enough, there were only 2 sounds left in the village: the monster and the blind man, both weeping. He didn't understand why it never took him. It wasn't fair. It took everything else. To leave him here alive when everyone and everything he'd ever known was destroyed was a greater punishment than even death. After killing all of these innocents, the monster had simply wandered off to the mountains again, the sound of its quiet sobs getting smaller and smaller until it was gone altogether. God comforted the blind man as he wept for the loss of all his loved ones. He told the blind man that he would venture up to the mountains himself and confront the creature on its own territory, and at the very least, find out why it had done this terrible thing. But first, he must relocate the blind man to a safer place. He placed a hand on the blind man's shoulder and he vanished. He would appear in another friendly village, miles away. God sent a silent message into the minds of every villager.
Take good care of this man. He has undergone horrors you can't even imagine. Your kindness will be rewarded later. For that, you have my promise.
God sighed and turned his tired eyes to the distant mountains. A monster lurked up there, perhaps one of his own creations, or maybe a corruption of one of his creations. Either way, whatever existed without his knowledge existed without his consent. and he intended to know of the beast in the mountains. Though given what he'd seen already, he didn't expect to receive a warm welcome from this murderous demon. Miles away up in the mountains, the creature licked the blood from its cracked lips. It looked like it might have once been a human being or something that aspired to humanity or mocked it with its very existence. It was a huge, gangling beast, skin alabaster, eyes empty and soulless, dribbling rivulets of burning tears down a hideous, gaunt face. It crawled into the frozen mouth of a cave with great icicle fangs, wheezing and weeping. All it ever wanted was to be alone. Why did they have to keep interfering? Didn't they know what happened? All the terrible things they made it do. The creature curled its long, gangly body into the fetal position, scratching great ruts into the sides of its bald cranium with long, sharp fingers. Terrible things. Terrible, terrible things. And then there was a brilliant flash just a few feet away. The monster was surprised. It turned to see a figure silhouetted in the mouth of the cave. He wore sandals and thin robes. His eyes glowed with a kind of power that the monster didn't recognize. This stranger stared at the monster without an ounce of fear in his heart. He stared right into its eyes, unwavering. No, 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 no! It could feel it again, the rage bubbling up deep down. A cauldron of seething anger. It hated the feeling like being lowered into a vat of molten metal. Unspeakable fire and pain coursing through every vessel. It began to weep and scream while the stranger in the cave mouth just watched, not moving a muscle.
Do you know who I am?
The stranger asked with a deep voice that betrayed almost infinite power, knowledge, and wisdom. But it wouldn't change the outcome here. The monster bounded at him at speeds that wouldn't be seen again until jet planes and bullet trains are invented millennia into the future. Its jaws were hanging impossibly wide, fangs borne, its arms extended, and deadly claws ready to strike. But before those terrible hands could close around the stranger, he vanished. The monster stumbled and rolled across the snow, confused. What trickery was being used here?
I'll take that as a no,
said the voice from behind him.
You ought to show your father some respect. More respect than you gave to those poor people down in the village, at least.
Seething, the creature turned and saw the stranger standing back in the darkness of the cave, staring at him. But the beast didn't have the capacity for awe or holy terror, only violence. Boundless, limitless, unstoppable violence. It darted towards the stranger again, trying to strike him. Somehow it was like fighting an empty robe. Not a single one of its deadly strikes seemed to hit the stranger. The stranger leaped backwards, putting some space between himself and the monster, but still not breaking a sweat. He breathed in deeply, then exhaled. The breath came out like a mighty typhoon, shocking even the monster with its sudden force. It was blown backwards, a leaf in the wind, until its long claws dug into the ground and anchored it in place. The stranger gave a wry smile at this, impressed.
My, you're certainly a tenacious one, aren't you?
He said.
Perhaps we can talk for a little while instead of fighting. I want to know why you killed all those people.
No answer. The beast roared, its mighty limbs pounding into the ground as it closed the gap between itself and the stranger in fractions of a second. It would kill him, rend him, destroy him just like all the others. He'd left it no choice. Suddenly the ground below it seemed to give way. The creature was confused. It looked down to see that the ancient stone below had somehow taken on the properties of a liquid, and it was sinking. The beast panicked and it began to thrash. It was a strong swimmer, but it didn't expect to need to swim here. The shock was too much, and soon the ground submerged it entirely, muffling its terrible roars and shrieks. And just like that, the ground was solid again, trapping the beast inside. The stranger stepped forward and looked at the ground.
A much-needed timeout,
he said.
You do yourself no good struggling like this.
Despite its terrible capacity for evil, God couldn't help but admire the beast, at least on the level of construction. It was so pared down, so unburdened. A killer to the core, but seemingly unkillable. Had he made this creature? Billions of species, and the species those in turn had created through billions of years of breeding and evolution. And somewhere along the line, this thing happened. It was easy even for the universe's creator to lose track of some of the tinier variables. And in the grand scheme of things, even this monster was still a tiny variable. But right here, right now, it was still one hell of a problem. The ground rumbled below God. Cracks formed. The mountain peak shook. God raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed, as the monster ripped free of its stone prison and re-entered the fray. It roared and screamed still, its blank eyes fixed on him. Its skeletal body throbbed and heaved with power. Unlike any other creature in nature, it was almost like the longer their conflict went on, the more energized the beast became. God sighed. All those poor villagers. They never stood a chance against this monster. It lunged for him, even faster and stronger than before. He teleported out of the way in the nick of time, and the beast's claws cleaved through a nearby cave wall, effortless. God materialized nearby, but he didn't have time to speak. The beast lunged again and again and again. Every time he reappeared, the beast went for him with impossible speed. Deciding to widen the playing field, God teleported to the top of the mountain. The creature, somehow sensing his presence, vaulted upwards and tunneled through the roof of the cave, bursting out of the ground in front of God, who was floating just slightly off the ground.
It would be wise of you to stop.
God carefully intoned.
All this time, you know, I've been going easy on you. You don't want to find out what the wrath of God looks like.
Storm clouds were gathering above. Mighty thunder roared across the sky. The beast was undeterred. It roared and galloped towards God, and God, in turn, called down a response. A volley of lightning the likes of which the world has never seen before or since struck down on the charging monster. The sudden white flash could sting the eyes from miles away. The monster shrieked from the blast, feeling its flesh lift off its bones and atomize in the sheer heat of the electricity around it. It could smell itself cooking. The lightning blast only lasted for a few seconds, but for the beast, it felt like eternity. When the onslaught stopped, the air was still heavy with electrical potential. God stared down at the black scorch mark on the side of the mountain where the creature had been standing. All the snow within a mile had been evaporated by the blast. It was a raw display of the power of nature that would make even Zeus tremble in his sandals. And yet, there was still movement. Something started to get up from the burnt patch where nothing should be left alive. A blackened skeleton, rising shakily from the ash, but still very much alive. As it started to rise, new flesh began growing over its bones little by little. Even God was astonished by the sight of it. He'd never seen a creature cling so ardently to life in spite of having truly unsurmountable power amassed against it. It was up against God, and still, it fought. The monster tottered on its freakishly long limbs, still disoriented, unusually staggered for a creature driven by such single-minded violent purpose. When enough of its face grew back to do so, it began to weep and sob again, tears streaking down its terrible face. Looking at this creature after all of this, God couldn't help but feel a new emotion, pity. He lowered himself to the ground and approached the creature, like none had ever done before. He gathered it up into his arms and he held it, feeling its heaving, wretched sobs against him. The beast was in so much pain, he could feel it, radiating from within.
Speak, my son,
God said in a soft, fatherly voice. And for the first and only time, the monster spoke.
Can look, can see, make me hurt people. Don't want hurt people. Can look, please.
That was all it managed to choke out before devolving back into unintelligible babble. But it was enough. Enough for God to understand its pain. He did not know if it would be right to change the monster's nature. Is it ever right to truly change anyone's nature? But it was within his almost limitless power to grant it one reprieve from pain. He settled the beast in the snow below him. It was quiet and still. And God said unto the beast,
Rest now, child. Rest for thousands of years if you must. I hope only that when you eventually awaken, you feel differently.
And so another story from the catalog of SCP-343. Of course, it leaves us with certain questions, chief among them being, is it true? Did 343 and 096 have this chance encounter long ago? Or is this just another tall tale from an anomaly who fancies himself a deity? We have our truth, and you have yours. Let us know what you believe down below in the comments. What do you do when the sun turns wrong? When light, which once represented life, joy, and warmth, becomes a symbol of death and destruction? Do you hide inside? Shutter the windows, keep out the light by any means necessary? Do you retreat underground, where the sun's rays cannot penetrate, burrowing into the dark and the cold? Do you simply give yourself to it, accepting that there is no escaping something so vast, so far-reaching as sunlight itself, and allow yourself to be lost in the end of all things? We've covered this possibility before. SCP-001, When Day Breaks, or SD Locke's proposal. It's difficult to know what any given person might do in such harrowing circumstances. After all, we have always learned to love the light and fear the darkness. It turns our very understanding of reality upside down to have that paradigm shifted, the dark becoming safety and the light becoming death. The source of all life on Earth, of all warmth, transforming in an instant from the sun as we know it to an Apollyon-class SCP that melts all living organisms that cross into its gaze. But what about a being that has always feared the light? Something that prioritizes solitude and never ever wants to be seen? How might it live out those darkened days? Today we're taking a look at what happens when daybreak meets a familiar face, even if a constantly hidden one. SCP-096. SCP-096, or the Shy Guy, is something of a celebrity around here. It is a humanoid creature with long distended arms, pale skin, and a jaw that can open 4 times wider than an ordinary human's. There is only one thing above all else that this entity desires: for no one to see its face. When someone views its face, it flies into an uncontrollable rage and seems to have no other option but to destroy the person who has seen it. So it is unlikely that a creature so intent on solitude would be in much danger from the transformed sun. In fact, it might even be a positive thing, and for some time it was. With so many human beings gone, reduced to gelatinous masses with no desire but to slither around in the ghoulish sunlight and merge with one another, there were fewer people to observe his face than ever. He could stay inside and know with almost complete certainty that no one would come to bother him. No one was coming to look at him, and there were no more visitors, researchers poking and prodding that might sneak a look at his face. And so he stayed there, in the room that had served as his containment unit before the world turned upside down. The masses of flesh that once were humans did not concern him, as they never looked at his face. All he did was stay in his room and never go outside. The outside frightened him terribly, though he was not concerned with the deadly sunlight or the possibility of it melting him as it had so many others. He was much more afraid that someone, some unlikely survivor clinging to their original life, might look at him, that they might see his face. That was simply too distressing to risk. He would much rather stay alone in his old cell, weeping softly in the shadows. One day, though we couldn't say how many days after the end of things it had been, he was weeping alone in his former cell. The days blurred together, spent the same way, and time had lost much of its meaning. Through the echoing sound of his sobs and the sloshing sounds of the creatures outside, a woman's voice cut through. It was faint, but he could make out what she was saying. She was calling out for help, asking if anyone had any food or fresh water. The sound was getting louder, closer, accompanied by the disconcerting thump of her footsteps. She was coming down the hall, as much as it could be called a hall anymore. She was coming towards his room to disrupt his miserable peace. He heard her steps cross the threshold of his room, and her voice broke into a terrified scream. No doubt at the unexpected sight of a pale, naked creature weeping in the corner of what she expected to be an empty room. Startled by the first loud sound he'd heard in a long time, in a world that had mostly been silent since the initial outpouring of agonized screams had faded into the soft slap of flesh and slime on the ground, he turned around. He shouldn't. Ordinarily, he wouldn't, but he couldn't stop himself. There he saw a woman, wide eyes filled with tears, face streaked with dirt, a small child next to her holding her hand and clinging to her leg. Just as he saw the woman, she saw him. She saw his face. Anger boiled over inside of him, and he let out a scream, wild, primal, and filled with inhuman rage. She could not be looking at him, seeing his face. He couldn't let her. The woman ran with the child in tow, panicked by the wild roar and the sight of him standing upright before her. The anger faded as she left his sight, making her way down the hall into the stairs. But then he remembered. She had seen his face. He could not let her leave. It was time to do something he never thought he'd have to do again. Hunt. His heightened senses picked up the sound of muffled footsteps coming up through the floor below him. She was downstairs, just beneath the floor where he was standing. His instincts kicked in, and his body moved almost of its own accord. He lifted his long arms above his head and drove his hands down into the floor. It was weakened by the ravages of the elements and time, and crumbled under his unnatural strength. He dug his claws into the plaster, tearing it apart and cracking it into pieces. He pushed his claws in deeper and deeper until he could feel them breaking through the other side. He pulled the floor apart until the hole was wide enough to fit through, then dropped down to the room below. He spotted the woman's back, fleeing through the door just as he landed. She was getting away. He tore after her, ripping through concrete and steel, destroying everything in his path in a mad dash for the object of his rage. He had to catch her. She could not be allowed to leave. She looked over her shoulder at him, her face a mask of pure terror. She knew, just as he knew, that there was no escape in sight. In his single-minded obsession and her desperation to escape from him, neither of them noticed that she had run so far and so carelessly that she was now outside the building. She had crossed from the shadows into the harsh light of the sun. The woman's eyes widened in grim understanding of her fate. He could only watch helplessly as her body began to succumb to the vicious rays. Almost instantly, she began to melt. As it was closest to the sun, her head was the first to go. Her nose drooped like hot wax, dripping as it went until it slumped off her face and landed on the ground with a sickening splash. Her eyes were next, popping out of their sockets and hanging loose and limp on her cheeks and dangling from sinewy strands. She tried in vain to stuff them back into place, but they squished in her hands like overripe fruit. She attempted to run into the comparative safety of the ruined building, but her feet were already beginning to spread out onto the street, melting into a sticky red smear on the pavement. Her legs crumbled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her face leaving a trail of gelatinous flesh as it landed. She tried uselessly to drag herself along the ground back into the darkness, but her arms were melting into the dirt, mixing with it into a horrible red mud. She let out a last scream of agony, but the sound turned to a thick gurgle as her lips fused together and her mouth melted into nothingness. He watched it all, sobbing and roaring in frustration. She was gone, and he would never get the satisfaction of ending her. The infernal sun had stolen her from him. Now, she was nothing but a wet shadow, like the rest of the humans had become long ago. He heard the sound of a soft sob behind him, a tiny human voice. He turned, looking for the source. There was the little girl. He had almost forgotten about her. She was calling out for her mother and crying, and she was looking right at him, right at his face. He waited for the anger to overtake him, but instead, there was nothing. Why wasn't he angry? She was looking at his face, so why? Then he realized. Her eyes were on him, but she did not see him. She was blind. She approached the creature, her arms outstretched following the sound of his crying. She touched his hand with her own tiny fingers, so small and fragile, and asked, "Mommy?" Then he felt something he had never felt before. Tenderness, care, a desire to protect this tiny, innocent being. It was the first time he had ever felt warm, ever felt anything but sadness, anger, or fear. Overcome with this softness, he wrapped his arms around the child and hugged her close. She hugged him back tightly, and the room went quiet as they both stopped crying. From that day on, they became a family of sorts. They lived together and he took care of her. She didn't know what he looked like and had no idea he might be something to fear. To her, he was safety. He was home. For the first time in his long, awful life, he felt like a human instead of a monster. He would scavenge food for her, bring her fresh water, lay down stolen blankets and pillows so she would have a soft place to rest. He even found her a ratty, worn teddy bear amongst the rubble and gave it to her as a gift. She clutched it to her chest and thanked him, and for once his tears were those of joy. In this cursed world, they had found something like happiness in one another. He knew he would protect her, no matter what. Then one day, everything changed. The creature and the little girl were playing in the abandoned site, making up little games together, when he took a break to look out at the window and monitor their surroundings. Outside, the evil red sun waited. When he turned back, the little girl was gone. One of the shadowy creatures, once human, was imitating his voice to lure her away. He could hear it in the distance, and her tiny footsteps following it. He chased after her, the only thing he had ever loved, and saw her just as she stepped out into the light. She screamed as one of her arms began to melt in the light, and he knew what he had to do. He grabbed her and pulled her back inside, using his body to shield her from the horrible rays. As he wept over her, his tears stopped her body from melting any further, but his body continued to fall apart. It was too late for him. He ran as far as he could. Once he transformed, he did not want to end up hurting the girl. He ran until his legs melted away and he could not run anymore. He had reached the shoreline and stared out at the ocean, unable to move anymore. He screamed a final time in agony, in heartbreak, in mourning for the happiness he had finally found and now would lose. But at least he knew, as his eyes melted away and he was nearly gone, that the girl would be safe. And then he was gone, and the world was quiet. The day-to-day routine of Dr. Gears consisted of a few constants: piping hot cups of black, unsweetened coffee, plain dry wheat toast, the soothing sounds of his favorite white noise machine, and the endless carousel of experiments with SCP-914. Not that he was complaining. He was perfectly content to spend his time supervising one of the few anomalies he crossed paths with on a regular basis that was unlikely to kill or maim him in any way. Not that the Clockworks hadn't produced its fair share of unpredictable results over the years of extensive testing. It had definitely offered up more than a few surprises. And anyone who knew Dr. Gears knew that he was not especially fond of surprises. Dr. Bright had attempted to throw a surprise birthday party for the man once, but when he turned on the lights and fired the confetti cannon, all Dr. Gears did in response was give a deep sigh and say, "Really, Jack? You're making a spectacle of yourself." Still, he had resigned himself long ago to the fact that supervising the experiments with SCP-914 meant witnessing some truly unpredictable outcomes. How could he forget the time researcher Blas tested an incandescent light bulb on the setting Very Fine, and the machine spat out an anthropomorphic humanoid light bulb that spoke in German-accented English and claimed to be Thomas Edison himself? This was, of course, impossible, as historical records surely would have indicated if Thomas Edison was a walking, talking light bulb rather than a human man. The imposter was eventually incinerated after its presence became too irritating to ignore. And then there was the time researcher Thompson filled out a Dungeons & Dragons character sheet and placed it into the machine on the setting Very Fine. The output produced was a sheet of paper promoting the previously non-existent tabletop role-playing game Fear in the Foundation. Whenever a person read the paper, they would suddenly find themselves in an out-of-body experience where they were inside the game's world, which contained several characters related to the SCP Foundation, as well as items and locations based on real-world counterparts. A subject in this state would only snap back to reality after winning or dying in the game. Researcher Jacobson rolled a 1 on stealth and saw SCP-096’s face in the game, and was later found dead in the anomalous items storage wing. There was no shortage of Foundation staff trying to use the machine for personal gain, too. Dr. Naismith placed his credit card inside on the setting Very Fine, using it to produce a card covered in unidentified corporate insignias and reading, Rank Aleph Infinite Money Privileges. When Dr. Coltrane issued a written warning, Dr. Naismith took that warning and then placed it into the machine on the same setting, producing a piece of official documentation from the O5 Council in support of his infinite money privileges. Junior researcher Summers attempted to use SCP-914 in a misguided attempt at self-improvement, placing not an object, but herself in the intake booth before running the machine on the setting Very Fine. It cleared her skin, lengthened her hair, and improved her figure. This was, of course, in violation of several employee guidelines, and she was promptly dismissed after emerging from SCP-914. Dr. Veritas left a note in the experiment log following this incident, reading, By the time we realized what she was actually doing, it was too late to stop her. Needless to say, she's since been terminated, and I hope I don't need to tell you all not to do that again. And with that, the guideline was clear. No one was permitted to use SCP-914 for personal gain, or to change anything about themselves. Potential complications were too risky, not to mention the conflicts of interest that would be introduced into what should be an impartial research process. As scientific objectivity's biggest fan, Dr. Gears couldn't agree more. So as he settled in for the day's round of tests, he intended to keep a watchful eye on things and ensure that no funny business would take place. He didn't have much reason for concern, as his colleague Dr. Bonita prepped her research materials. She was working with 2 items, a small replica of Michelangelo's sculpture of David, and a sealed envelope containing something that was to be handled with extreme caution, a photograph of SCP-096’s face. She planned to place the items inside on the Very Fine setting, in an attempt to see what result might be produced from combining an ideal of traditional beauty standards with the image of a creature that felt such profound shame and distress as its own appearance that it would destroy anyone who looked at its face. Like any good scientist, Dr. Bonita wanted to remove any unnecessary variables from her experiment. So as she placed her items inside the intake booth, she slowly, delicately unsealed the envelope. She wanted to put the picture inside by itself, without the extra element of the envelope potentially complicating things. Unfortunately, like Marie Curie slowly, unintentionally poisoning herself with her own research materials, she didn't truly understand the danger of what she held in her hands. Just as she was setting the photograph down, her eyes flickered to the image. Before she could stop herself, before she could even look away or squeeze her eyes shut, she caught a glimpse of the one thing she should never look at: SCP-096’s face. She gasped and slammed the photograph down, but she knew it was too late. The sound of an inhuman shriek coming from across the facility signaled that she was right. It was coming for her, and nothing in the world could stop it. In a containment cell on the other side of the facility, Foundation staff were horrified as they heard the telltale scream of an enraged SCP-096. The pale, thin creature, once huddled in the corner silently, had stretched to its full height of 2.38 meters and was screaming, sobbing, wailing in gibberish, and beginning to tear its way out of its chamber. Guards tried their best to subdue the entity, firing their weapons at it, but the bullets did nothing to damage the creature's pale flesh or stop its movements. It ripped through the steel cube that contained it and knocked the guards out of its way with one swipe of its unnaturally long arms, sending them careening into a nearby wall. Fortunately for them, SCP-096 only knocked them unconscious. It didn't stop to harm them further, as it had a more important goal in mind: find the person who had seen its face and destroy them. As the alarm blared, signifying a high threat level containment breach, SCP-096 loped down the hall toward Dr. Bonita in SCP-914's room. Dr. Gears had not spotted Dr. Bonita's grave mistake and had no idea what had triggered the alarm he was hearing. He stepped away from the observation window, turning his attention to the crisis that was clearly happening somewhere else in the facility. Meanwhile, Dr. Bonita was panicking. She saw her life flash before her eyes, the certainty of impending doom that was coming for her and coming fast, all because of one brief error in judgment. What could she do? There was nowhere to hide, no way she could run away fast enough, unless if she managed to lure 096 into the intake booth and start the machine while the creature was inside, maybe it would transform into something less intent on tearing her limb from limb. It was a risky move, and one that could jeopardize her position at the Foundation, but she couldn't very well keep her job if she was dead, so it seemed like it just might be worth a shot. A primal roar of agony and fury interrupted her thoughts, and she knew that SCP-096 was moments away from breaking down the door and getting its hands on her. She would have to move fast. With a screeching grind of metal on metal, SCP-096 wrenched the door off its hinges and barreled into the room in its search for the person who had seen its face. It ran toward the silhouette of Dr. Bonita standing just at the entrance to the intake booth. She tucked and rolled out of the way just as the monster entered the booth. The door automatically slid shut behind it, and as SCP-096 rattled the door and tried to free itself, she turned the knob to very fine with every ounce of strength and speed she had. There was a ding of a small bell, and the machine whirred to life as the objects inside were refined. Dr. Bonita had no idea what would be waiting for her in the output booth, but she could only hope that her last-ditch effort had managed to save her life. In the fog of panic, she briefly felt an itch of scientific curiosity, too. What would become of a being like SCP-096 in a machine as strange and wonderful as SCP-914? What would the addition of the statue do to it? As the door to the outtake booth slid open, steam poured out. It appeared her questions would soon be answered. Cautiously, in spite of herself, Dr. Bonita called out, "Hello?" No one answered, but she heard the sound of footsteps, slow and careful, as a figure emerged from the mist. She covered her mouth in shock, her eyes wide. "Dear God," she whispered in awe. Standing in front of her with pale, smooth skin and the same imposing stature was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Wide, dark eyes shone under thick, sculpted eyebrows. Under the eyes, an aquiline nose, full, pouty lips, a strong, sharp jawline. His head was topped with a tangle of lustrous dark curls. It was the kind of hair she had only seen flowing in the wind on the covers of the romance novels she wanted desperately to buy, but was too embarrassed to be seen purchasing. His physique was, well, statuesque, like the build of the very Michelangelo sculpture she had placed into the machine just moments ago. There was no other way to say it. He was handsome, despite still being a little lanky and 9 feet tall. He peered at her curiously, towering over her in a way that had been terrifying in his former shape, but now made her heart skip a beat in an entirely different way. "Hi," was all she could think to say. Was she blushing? She shook her head, snapping herself out of it. She was a scientist, damn it, not some giddy schoolgirl passing notes in class. This was an incredible achievement, something she would need to study thoroughly, and she very much wanted to study him thoroughly. Nope, no time for that. She needed to write up a report, to inform her superiors, to try her best not to lose her job over this. She had to remain professional. "Hi," the man that had once been, or perhaps still was, SCP-096 spoke. "Oh, you can talk." Dr. Bonita laughed in surprise. The man's brow furrowed. His newfound ability to speak was a surprise to him too, it seemed. "Yes, I can. What happened to me?" he asked, stumbling over his words slightly, getting used to the feeling of them. "You ran into the machine," she gestured to SCP-914. "I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, but you're very different now." He nodded. "I feel different. I feel calm." He sighed, the relief plain on his face before a shadow of sadness fell over him. "I don't think I have to hurt anymore. I'm sorry for what I did before." Dr. Bonita did not know what to say. How do you respond when something you've been studying from afar, been horrified and fascinated by in equal measure, looks at you with a new, beautiful face and apologizes for all the harm it caused? This whole experience was so surreal that she might think she was dreaming if she didn't work at a place that was one long waking dream, or nightmare, depending on the day. Dr. Bonita, there's been a containment breach. Are you all right?" Dr. Gears had returned to the room, taking in the sight of the destruction left in 096's wake. I'm fine, she called to him, and he followed her voice into the room, then stopped at the sight of the transformed anomaly. I don't have time for whatever this is. I trust you'll handle it. Dr. Gears took a long sip of his coffee, and taking Bonita's shocked silence as confirmation, had a leisurely stroll back to his office. A few moments later, the guards responsible for containing SCP-096 arrived on the scene, expecting to see carnage and find a docile SCP-096 crouched over a lifeless body. But instead, they found the same truly bizarre sight that Dr. Gears had shrugged off, and Dr. Bonita was still doing her best to process. They entered the room with their weapons drawn, but quickly lowered them, scratching their heads in confusion instead, before radioing their superiors and asking for further instructions. Responses from various Foundation staff who caught a glimpse of SCP-096's bold new look included, "Oh, would you look at that? Who's that guy? He's what?" And in the words of Dr. Jack Bright, "Oh no, he's hot!" Dr. Bright also proposed making the new SCP-096 a TikTok account and YouTube channel, seeking modeling representation for him, or selling a novelty calendar filled with pictures of 096 in various costumes. These would be, in his words, quote, "excellent ways to increase revenue for the Foundation." So really, you're the weird ones now for thinking my ideas are weird. Dr. Bright was asked to leave SCP-096 alone and stop trying to take his headshot. In the days that followed the incident with SCP-914, the SCP Foundation was at a loss about what to do with this new, seemingly harmless version of SCP-096. Dozens of D-Class were brought in to look at his face and see if the entity would still enter one of his rage states after a few days of getting used to his new form, but he never did. No screaming, no swallowing people whole, nothing more than a polite, if somewhat shy greeting and a courteous, "How are you doing today?" The D-Classes were relieved, but confused about being pulled from their cells just to stare at some random handsome man. Dr. Clef suggested dissecting SCP-096 to see what his new body looked like on the inside. This request was denied. Several interviews were conducted to evaluate SCP-096's mental and emotional state. Now that the anomaly was capable of coherent speech, it was much simpler to evaluate the potential threat level he might pose. Every researcher who spoke with him came to the same conclusion. Gone was the danger of the old SCP-096. He had not just become beautiful in a classical, superficial sense, but he had become beautiful on the inside as well. Interviewers reported a warm, friendly demeanor, a talent for engaging in conversation once he was made to feel comfortable, and a sincere interest in the thoughts, opinions, and feelings of those he spoke with. There was only one thing left to do: to make sure that SCP-096 had really changed from something deadly to something almost resembling an ordinary person. A photograph of SCP-096's face, of its original face, was removed from a secure vault by a D-Class. Then, the D-Class was sent into a room with SCP-096 and instructed to place the photograph on the table. SCP-096 looked down at what had once been his face, and his eyes filled with tears. A soft, broken sob left his lips, and he wrapped his arms around himself, hunching over as if in physical pain. Outside the room, guards prepared to handle things if 096 began to attack. Instead, he wiped his tears, took a deep, shuddering breath, and looked at the D-Class with a somber expression. He picked up the photograph on the table and tore it in half, as he finally summoned the strength to speak. "Please, get rid of these. That is not who I am anymore." At Dr. Bonita's strong insistence, backed up by the conclusions of the research staff who interviewed SCP-096, a reevaluation of the entity's containment measure was ordered. It seemed cruel and unnecessary waste of resources to keep 096 trapped in a steel cube in its current form. He would be moved to a standard humanoid containment cell and treated as well as other safe-class anomalies, provided with books, films, food, and drink upon request, and, of course, other comforts. Of course, the O5 Council insisted on evaluating the entity before any of these changes could be approved. Dressed in a specially tailored suit provided by Dr. Bonita, SCP-096 appeared before the Council to present his case. "I know that I might not have the best record at the Foundation. I've done a lot of damage over the years, though, let's be honest, you all aren't exactly innocent either. Sorry, that was an attempt at a joke. I'm still very new to talking. All I can say is please consider giving me another chance to make a real life here, to make this place my home. Thank you for your time." What SCP-096 didn't know is that the O5 Council was so flabbergasted by the sight of his new face that they didn't retain a single word he said. They had all given their official approval before he even finished his short presentation. Before long, SCP-096 was moved out of his steel cube and into a new containment chamber that resembled a mid-range studio apartment, complete with a bed, a kitchenette, a television, and a table and chairs. He was provided access to all major streaming platforms, as well as a large stack of books to help him develop his grasp of culture and language after so very long being isolated from human society. Though he wasn't exactly human, he was determined to act like it. Word quickly spread around the Foundation site, and humans and anomalies alike flocked to SCP-096's new home to visit him and see the miraculous transformation for themselves. SCP-999 was the first to come and see the new and improved 096, chirping excitedly as it oozed into his room. He pet the slime gently, his face breaking into a warm smile as its euphoric effect washed over him. The slime became so excited at meeting this new friend, someone it had known as a source of sadness and hurt for so long, that it tackled him to the ground and tickled him for several minutes. 096 laughing uproariously all the while. SCP-343 stopped by to give 096 his blessing and wish him well in this new chapter of life. A few days later, SCP-507 popped back into the site and wanted to see the changes for himself. He was thoroughly impressed, though privately confessed to missing 096's more monstrous form, which reminded him of some of his favorite cryptids. There was one anomaly that was not thrilled with the appearance of SCP-096, however. SCP-056 was furious upon hearing about the new beautiful man that everyone just couldn't shut up about. It demanded a chance to speak to SCP-096 and to tell him that, "This place isn't big enough for the both of us. I'm the fairest one of all, you sniveling little worm." But the request was denied. SCP-056 sulked about it for several weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Bonita was still intent on getting to know SCP-096 better. During previous testing with SCP-978, the Desire camera, a photo taken of SCP-096 revealed that his greatest desire was to disappear. Curious about the results would be now, Dr. Bonita received permission to take another picture of SCP-096. She snapped the photo while 096 was sitting in a chair in his new containment chamber, looking directly at the camera. When the photo developed, the result was simple. Everything in the picture was exactly the same with one exception. Dr. Bonita was pictured sitting next to 096, her hand clasped in his. Both were smiling soft, contented smiles. When she showed him the photograph, he smiled at her and shook his head. "It really is an amazing camera." She flushed. "Doctor, before you go, could I ask your name?" Dr. Bonita smiled and nodded. "It's Isabel. What should I call you?" SCP-096 paused thoughtfully for a moment. He was giving himself a name for the very first time, allowing himself an identity other than a strange, hollow, pale thing that existed to cry and suffer and hurt. Finally, he answered her, "Call me David." Dr. Dan anxiously paced in his cell. It was the only way he'd been able to occupy himself for the past 6 months, save for poring through files and, when he was lucky, being able to oversee another failed termination attempt. He only stopped pacing when, for a brief and horrible moment, he realized that monster was probably doing the exact same thing in its big metal cube at this very moment. That horrible creature that he'd thrown away his life for a futile shot at killing. Perhaps the whole thing had been a fool's errand. After all, he was formerly a researcher under the employ of the SCP Foundation. Secure, contain, protect. They had truly sadistic beasts like SCP-106, the Nightmarish Old Man, and SCP-352 Baba Yaga in containment cells, and there was no plans to terminate either of them. They weren't the Global Occult Coalition for 343's sake. Why did Dr. Dan even want to terminate SCP-096 in the first place? He tried to explain it to them again and again, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. In his mind, the impetus for destroying the Shy Guy was terrifyingly clear. It was a monster that killed anyone or anything that looked at its face, even a photograph of it, even a tiny collection of pixels. When its rage state was induced, it seemed that nothing would stop it. It would have an intuitive psychic link to its victim, charge at them at breakneck speed, and only find its zen again once all of them were dead. and if a picture of SCP-096 was leaked onto the internet, it would cause a chain reaction that triggered an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. There were plenty of creatures and entities that the Foundation knew about that could theoretically bring about the apocalypse, but to him, 096 was the most realistic. It preyed upon the inherent curiosity and thirst for knowledge seated in every human heart. The same drive to simply know that led to the creation of the SCP Foundation would be humanity's doom in the face of an SCP-096 outbreak. And if such a thing happened, the Foundation would need to break the masquerade of secrecy to have any hope of saving humanity. In his many feverish nightmares, Dr. Dan had seen it all so clearly. The first photographs of SCP-096's face would be leaked online. Perhaps a few hundred people across the globe would look, in disparate enough locations that it would be almost impossible for the Foundation to detect and save all of them, as SCP-096 went on its bloody rampage. Of course, as the image proliferated, as images on the internet often do, the purview of 096's violence would only grow. People across the nation would start to take notice, and soon after that, across the world. Mysterious creature causing mass casualties would be the headline on every news desk, because why would anybody want to talk about anything else? Perhaps some foolish reporters would take video footage of the creature. Everyone has a phone these days with high-definition cameras. Pictures would be taken and posted. More and more of it would flood the internet. Too many simultaneous moles for even the SCP Foundation to whack. The news would spread. Panic and hysteria would spread. People wouldn't even know what's triggering all this horror if the Foundation didn't go public and tell them that it was the pictures that was killing everyone. And by then, wouldn't it already be too late? The antidote to fear is knowledge. It's why when anything goes wrong, we're refreshing timelines and feeds and news websites for any kind of information. And if you were told an unstoppable monster was killing scores of people and might be coming to a neighborhood near you sometime soon, wouldn't you want a good look at it? Wouldn't you want to know your enemy? Having no idea that the mere act of knowing was what sealed your horrible fate. By Dr. Dan's bleak estimations, if only several million people died as a result of this kind of scenario, it could be considered a positive outcome. He'd seen it all, but no matter how many times he tried to articulate this to his superiors, he wasn't listened to. They didn't take him or the threat that SCP-096 posed seriously. Every time he warned of the apocalyptic potential of SCP-096, he was simply told to get back to working on those goggles. It was why he needed to give those naysayers a demonstration. It was why a certain photograph needed to show up in the home of a certain mountaineer. It's why all those people had to die. There was no other way. The deaths of the civilians and the researchers and the mobile task force members were, of course, regrettable, but it was the only way to prevent the deaths of so many more. They gave him what he wanted, permission to put this gangly time bomb in the ground, even if the beast's death was inextricably tied to his own execution at the hands of the very employers who authorized him. The world was full of funny little ironies like that. Another one is that even though Dr. Dan now had the authorization and funding to terminate SCP-096, he was discovering that he lacked another important factor, the capability. They'd tried incinerating it, exposing it to massive amounts of radiation, exposing it to an insane degree of kinetic trauma, the equivalent of being hit by an out-of-control bullet train. They tested every kind of experimental, off-the-books weaponry that they had access to through various research projects. Proton blasts, lasers, high-intensity energy beams. Nothing. Even when they fried off every scrap of flesh on the monster's body, its unbreakable skeleton still remained, and in what seemed like no time at all, it'd be back in action. Its very existence seemed to mock him. A guard opened his cell door, staring disdainfully at the disgraced researcher. That same guard had slammed his head against a wall a month earlier. One of his friends had apparently been killed in the legendary 096 containment breach that set this whole sordid thing in motion. "Up and at 'em, scumbag!" he said in a gruff, surly voice, training a handgun on the doctor he knew wouldn't fight back. They need you in test chamber 6. Dr. Dan allowed himself a small grin, imperceptible to the guard who clearly hated his guts. They'd approved his 096 versus 682 cross-test. Marvelous. How marvelous. To all the others, it would seem like just one more entry in a long line of 682 cross-tests. He thought it darkly funny. In his eyes, the Foundation had no hope of ever killing SCP-682. Its defining quality was being impossible to kill, and it didn't present nearly the threat to the entire world that 096 posed. Their futile attempts to murder the lizard were little more than a money sink to justify the site's exorbitant funding. But perhaps he could turn this to his benefit. Maybe SCP-682 would hold the secret to actually killing off his nemesis. Within 30 hours, Dr. Dan had his disappointing answer. Both anomalies had undeniably done a real number on each other, and Dr. Dan did take a kind of sick amusement in the mental trauma that SCP-682 had induced in 096. But ultimately, it was all for nothing. 682 had skinned 096 alive and melted off its flesh with acid, but once again, that indestructible skeleton stood firm. This had been the 27th termination attempt since the incident. The 27th failed termination attempt, Dr. Dan mentally corrected himself. 096's skeleton kept defeating them. Even their most ardent attempts to penetrate the bones and destroy the creature within had failed. During a previous attempt, they tried to access the brain by putting a diamond-hard drill into its eye sockets. Of course, it was the drill that actually broke, much to Dr. Dan's seemingly tireless frustration. Needless to say, in the debriefing interview with Dr. Carver, a researcher who once would have considered him a colleague, he wasn't in high spirits. If he managed to kill this thing, then he would always be the hero who made a terrible sacrifice in order to save many more lives. If he didn't kill 096, he was little more than the monster who murdered all those innocent people for nothing. Though you'd never hear him say it out loud. If it wasn't for that damnable, indestructible skeleton, this monster would be long dead already. If only there was some way to break the creature's bones. That's when it hit him. SCP-173, the sculpture. A Site-19 icon often overlooked because of its more silent but deadly style, but undeniably one of the most frightening and dangerous anomalies out there. It had racked up a truly shocking body count since it was first interred at Site-19 in 1993, one broken neck at a time, and it's one of the few creatures out there that even the hard-to-destroy reptile himself is utterly terrified of. Perhaps a monster that practically has a PhD in breaking bones would be the ideal candidate to vandalize the Shy Guy's vertebrae. Once his proposal was greenlit for initial testing, Dr. Dan arranged for the Shy Guy, with a bag over his head of course, to be brought into a testing chamber with the ever-stoic SCP-173. When all of the researchers and guards were safely outside, all it took was a single blink to make all of Dr. Dan's darkest dreams come true. In the nanoseconds his eyes were closed, he heard the most beautiful sounds in the world. A loud, fleshy crunch, and a pained howl from 096. He opened his eyes to an equally wondrous sight. 096 doubled over at an unnatural angle. Its spine snapped between the 4th and 5th vertebrae, spinal fluid leaking down the creature's flank. That freaky little sculpture had done it. It had actually damaged the integrity of the Shy Guy's skeleton. It was at that moment that Dr. Dan knew he could kill this thing. Admittedly, there was a containment breach shortly after that when the bag slipped off of 096's head, and it charged through the nearby steel wall, killing multiple people before being subdued and recontained. But when it comes to projects involving Dr. Dan, a mere handful of innocent people being killed sits comfortably within the acceptable margin of error. A day later, Dr. Dan was standing before a crowded boardroom, with agents, researchers, and even a few members of the O5 Council in attendance. He explained his findings to them, and the fact that, even more importantly, they may have a way to bring the wretched existence of 096 to an absolute halt. His plans were approved. Not long after, he was putting them into motion. Dr. Dan was surrounded by researchers and heavily armed guards as 173 was escorted into the test chamber with a forklift. 096 was there, still bagged. Off to the side was a giant tub of hydrofluoric acid connected to a hose and injector attachment. If this didn't work, nothing would. Everyone stood back in a safe zone as 173 was released to do its thing. Crunch. Just like the previous time, 096's spine had been successfully snapped. Spinal fluid dribbled down its skin. Everyone had rushed into the chamber. One group kept 173 isolated with their stares. The other, headed by Dr. Dan, prepared the acid injector and shoved it into the breach in 096's spine. As the acid was pumped by the gallon into 096's bones, the creature let out the most horrifying wail. It kicked and bucked as more acid was pumped in, melting those indestructible bones from within. The creature even began to vomit acid as it panicked, melting the bag off of its own head. Some panicked and averted their gaze. Dr. Dan didn't. He stared directly at the creature's face for the first time as it melted in front of him with nothing short of pure elation. Had he won? Had he actually won? The creature let out a gurgling shriek and the guards opened fire. Their bullets splattered into the monster's melting flesh and bones as it hollered and shrieked. They didn't let up, firing up and down its body, spraying it with white-hot lead. It began to melt and bubble away, expanding into a great, gruesome puddle on the floor beneath them. Dr. Dan laughed like a madman. Even as the guards grabbed him and dragged him away from the foul-smelling, greasy mess, bubbling with chemical life, he just kept laughing. Even though he knew the death of 096 meant an equally swift death of his own, it didn't matter. It had all been for something. The world was saved. It was over. He'd finally won. A lot of us wish we could travel the multiverse, pay a visit to another world and see all the ways in which it differs from this dimension that we call home. Maybe there's a decision that you made that altered the course of your entire life. What college you went to, asking somebody out, accepting a job over pursuing a passion. The question of what if might have kept you wondering what your life could have looked like if you picked the other path. Surely it would save you all that wondering and be so much easier just to go and find out. Imagine if you could simply pick a universe where you chose differently, then take a quick jaunt over there to see how things turned out for your other self. But what if you couldn't choose? Never mind whatever that decision was, what if you couldn't pick where in the infinite multiverse you ended up? If traveling from world to world was as random, unpredictable, and instinctive as a sneeze, what then? One moment you're safe at home, surrounded by everything you know. It might not be perfect, but at least it's familiar. The next thing you know, with the blink of your eyes, you're standing in a world that maybe looks similar, but giant bees are the dominant species instead of humans, or the world is overrun by spiders, or everyone is made out of paint. Needless to say, you'd be at least a little disoriented, at worst, absolutely terrified for your life. That pretty much sums up the experience of SCP-507, also known as the Reluctant Dimension Hopper. From the outside, he looks to be a mostly normal human man, with blonde hair, green eyes, nothing all that remarkable about him of note, save for him having a somewhat unplaceable accent. Despite having a legal name, SCP-507 will try to squeeze what little enjoyment he can out of introducing himself by a different nickname to everyone he meets. Previous favorites have included Tommy, Steve, Bruto, Guy, Houdini, and Grabnock the Destroyer. We'll stick with Tommy. The sole most intriguing thing about Tommy is that through a process that happens completely without his control, he can spontaneously disappear, only to reappear after an unspecified amount of time later. During that time, SCP-507 will have been in a completely different universe to our own. This can happen at any time of day or night, and usually at the most inconvenient moments, including while Tommy is in the middle of a conversation, trying to sleep, or using the, facilities. He has no control over when it happens. However, he'll always arrive in an alternate universe in the same geographical spot he was in while in ours. If he moves around in a parallel world, then when he returns, he will have relocated to the corresponding place back in this universe. And that's when disaster struck. Alarms were blaring, declaring to all staff on site that there had been a containment breach in one of the anomaly's holding cells. All hands were on deck, and security teams were converging, dashing through the corridors. This was the second alert today. At first, SCP-507 had vanished on one of his unplanned little excursions, but now it seemed that another SCP was trying to do the same. Dazed, trying to reorient himself, Tommy rested against a nearby wall. His head was spinning, and he knew it would for a few more seconds. He was in a cell similar to the one he'd just been in while in another universe, except here, back home, there was a key difference. The cell was occupied. As soon as his vision cleared, Tommy looked up at the only other creature in the room with him. It was a tall, wiry humanoid shape, completely hairless with pale skin, white eyes, and a large, gaping jaw. Turning to face him, Tommy instantly recognized the creature from a description he'd been read by a Foundation researcher. It was SCP-096. Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs. Realizing its face was being observed, the Shy Guy started screeching, first an uncontrollable wail of distress that quickly gave way to a guttural, animalistic roar of anger. It covered its face, babbling to itself as Tommy backed away, banging his head against the sealed wall of 096's cell. Then, the creature turned towards him and lunged, racing across the room to where SCP-507 was trapped. All he could do was close his eyes tight and think about running away. Tommy could feel a headache brewing in his skull and caught traces of a familiar flash through his closed eyelids. He gently opened them back up. It had happened again, maybe for the first time ever at a moment when he actually needed to get away. Staggering to his feet, Tommy looked around. He was in the cell still, or rather, another version of it in a different universe yet again. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to predict when he would next displace, he didn't want to reappear right back where he had started, with SCP-096 poised to kill him. So relocating was top priority. Fortunately, the cell actually had a door in this universe, and that door wasn't locked. In fact, none of the doors were locked or even guarded, and the Foundation facility, while looking more or less the same, was completely abandoned. It almost looked like it had never even been used. Stepping out of the entrance, Tommy trekked his way towards the city. He knew it was a short hike away, and by the time he could feel blisters forming on his feet, he was close enough that it didn't matter. With another few short steps, he was standing among the tall buildings and surprisingly empty streets. One of the first things that struck Tommy about this universe was that there were hardly any people around outside. On top of that, the roads were devoid of cars. Everything around was so quiet. The air was still and clean when he breathed it in. The sound of footsteps against the pavement immediately caught Tommy's attention, the first sign of anyone else around other than him. Racing towards the noise of another person, Tommy turned a corner and bumped straight into an old man in a long coat, who had clearly been in a hurry, and quickly revealed he didn't have the best temperament either.
"Watch where you're going!"
he shouted, caught off guard by the sight of another person put on the streets.
What the hell are you playing at, sneaking up on me like that? You're trying to get yourself killed out here?
Oh, definitely not, Tommy said, climbing back to his feet, hands held out apologetically.
I'm so sorry, mister. I was just... You got a death wish or something, kid?
The old man demanded, marching past him.
No.
SCP-507 protested, chasing after the man.
Wait, what makes you say that? As if you don't know,
he scoffed.
Look around you. Look up at the sky. There's a storm about to hit any second now. It's a-coming. And if you don't get inside, you're a goner.
What could be so dangerous about a thunderstorm? Tommy asked. The old man stared back at him with a look of confusion on his wizened face, looking at Tommy like he had just said something utterly bizarre.
What the hell's a thunderstorm?
The man asked. Feeling equally confused, Tommy craned his neck up towards the sky. Looming above were swirling masses of clouds, the kind anyone would expect to be accompanied by severe winds and the deafening boom of thunder. But the wind was still, and there was nothing but silence, until a choking, gurgling sound came from somewhere behind Tommy's back. He spun around to see the tall, wiry frame of SCP-096, its long fingers gripping tightly around the old man's throat. It had followed Tommy, and he knew that anyone who saw its face, even in a picture, would find themselves chased down on foot by the creature. But he had no idea the Shy Guy could travel between dimensions. He'd foolishly allowed himself to think he was safe out of the monster's reach, but now it seemed to be showing him that the opposite was true. It hoisted the helpless old man upwards by his neck, his shoes barely able to graze the pavement as his legs flailed, eyes rolling back as the Shy Guy clamped his throat shut. The very second Tommy turned to run, the clouds churned above, and without so much as a warning, the storm hit. Something wasn't right. Tommy could feel his feet lifting off the ground, immediately panicking as he thought SCP-096 had grabbed him. But looking over his shoulder showed the creature was still a few feet behind and starting to gently float up off the ground too. Instinctively, Tommy's legs started thrashing around, trying to gain a solid footing. Instead, all his urgent motions did was cause him to start spinning uncontrollably as the gravity storm lifted him higher and higher up into the air. Spinning him around as he was taken further upwards, Tommy caught sight of SCP-096. The Shy Guy was staying still, as if it was still in control of its body's motion while he was wildly flipping over himself. The tall, pale creature drifted closer to the side of a nearby building, with Tommy being barely able to reach the top of the streetlights as he was pulled further away from the safety of having both his feet on the ground. Just as he saw SCP-096 push itself off the edge of the building, drifting straight through the air towards him, Tommy shut his eyes again and prayed he'd displace again. Sure enough, a flash of light came bursting out in time with another headache. Suddenly, he had appeared in the exact same spot in another universe. However, here there was no gravity storm in progress here. In fact, no such phenomenon existed. The laws of physics were much more in keeping with those in Tommy's home, our universe. Of course, that would be more reassuring if he wasn't already several feet up in the air. The second he arrived, Tommy started plummeting back down to Earth, screaming as he felt himself falling, keeping his eyes screwed shut as he dared not look at the ground he was currently hurtling towards. His plummet was broken by something not particularly soft. Whatever it was seemed to tower high enough that Tommy only picked up a few bruises as he hit it, but the fall didn't stop instantly. Instead, he kept on toppling through whatever he had landed on. It was some kind of mass, piled up almost as tall as a building, a collection of lots of things that were all brushing past Tommy the more he fell. He hadn't yet stopped for long enough to recognize the sensations, that is, until he landed with a painful thud. Slowly opening his eyes back up, Tommy could barely see anything in front of him. He was so deep in the mass that the pile was blocking out the sunlight, with only a few beams bleeding through the gaps, but barely enough to give him a clear view of where he was. Tommy tried to crawl forward, squeezed between the heavy things around him, pushing through whatever tiny little crevice he could find. As he did, the weight of the pile shifted around him, and he was worried that any moment he would move the wrong part of it, bringing the whole structure collapsing down on top of him like a toppled Jenga tower, only big enough to crush him to death. He forced himself not to think about exactly what the pile was made of either. It was already long past the point where Tommy recognized what each thing felt like. Plus, there was the added stench, something or lots of somethings, rotting and producing a stomach-turning odor as it decayed. Even when you're not trying to look, it can be hard to mistake the feeling of a hand, an arm, cold skin against his. The light from beyond the pyramid was getting closer, as he could see was starting to eliminate more of his surroundings the closer he crawled to the perimeter. Sure, he could have very easily used the torch the Foundation let him keep with him, but Tommy wasn't quite ready to see what he was crawling through yet, intentionally shutting his eyes and opting instead to follow the faint glow and distant warmth of the sun. Breaching the outer side of the pile, Tommy gulped down lungfuls of air. It barely tasted or smelled that much cleaner than the air within the mass, but at least he was free. Clawing himself out and along the ground, he finally, carefully stood up, still keeping both eyes screwed shut. Part of him really didn't want to take a look around at this new dimension. Maybe if he waited long enough, he would displace again and end up somewhere with less decomposing. But then he remembered SCP-096 was still after him, and he had no idea how to escape it. He needed to try and figure out what he was going to do, and the only way to do that was to look around at where he was. Lifting his eyelids, the different-sized masses of all shades, shapes, and sizes lay before him. Each one was coated in one unifying color, all of them slick with the crimson of blood against skin. Tommy could feel the urge to throw up quickly, shooting up from the pit of his stomach towards his throat as he looked at the massive pile of bodies in front of him. It was enormous. There were so many dead people, all laying on top of one another, that the pile reached up as tall as office buildings. And the pile that he had fallen into and crawled his way out of wasn't the only one either. As far as the eye could see, everyone was dead. Feeling a heavy sob at the back of his throat, Tommy swallowed it when he heard another sound above the low buzzing of flies over the human carcasses. Something else was crying nearby. And the moment he turned around, the familiar figure caught Tommy's eye. Even without being the only other living thing around for miles, the shy guy still stood out clear as day. Its distress at finding itself in this horrible dimension briefly mirrored Tommy's own, until it re-established its psychic link with its victim and gave chase once more. SCP-096 started dashing towards SCP-507. For a split second, he thought about just letting it catch him. What difference would it make in a place like this? But then the hallucinations of bright colors and a stinging deep within his skull hit Tommy, and just like that, he was gone again. It was nighttime in the next dimension Tommy arrived in. The cold air and dim light of the street were enough to give that away, but at least he was away from that last world filled with discarded and unburied piles of corpses, he thought to himself. Surely he couldn't possibly be anywhere worse than that now. The first sight that Tommy was met with was a huge white LCD screen, big enough to cover the entire side of one of the skyscrapers facing him. Emblazoned against the bright white glow was a familiar symbol, a circle with 3 arrows crossing its outline and pointing towards its center. Around that was a thin frame, another circle, this one with 3 protruding rectangles around the circumference, in line with the arrow tails. Thick lettered text appeared on the screen too, beneath the emblem, boldly proclaiming that anyone reading it should submit, comply, persevere. Tommy blinked in disbelief, looking around. There was hardly anyone else around, save for a few people staring at him. Had they seen him appear? Or was it just because he was dressed so differently to them? Each of them had on a grimy pair of overalls, sporting more of that same symbol on the chest and across the back. Every wall of every nearby building was overfilled with posters featuring matching imagery, each one posing different questions in the same unforgiving, accusatory text against its clinical white background. One poster read, "Could you be anomalous? Submit for testing today." Another had the following notice, "Curfew still in effect, 10 a.m. to 8 a.m. the following morning. All citizens must comply." And one more touting that, "Only through persevering will we continue to thrive." Each of them was signed with the same name and logo to match, the organization that Tommy had come to put some amount of trust in, even though they weren't always clear with him. But he knew they weren't the bad guys. Or at least, the version that existed in his universe didn't seem to be that bad. They had questionable methods, but they weren't evil. Weren't this.
By order of the SCP Foundation,
A loud militaristic voice barked from behind Tommy.
Get down on your knees with your hands behind your head. You will surrender any anomalous technology and declare any mimetic effects or cognitohazardous abilities before we approach you.
Tommy looked over his shoulder, met with the barrels of several automatic weapons that were now being trained on him. Instantly, he threw his hands in the air, terrified that this alternate SCP Foundation might be far more trigger-happy than the version of them he was used to. From the look at the oppressive text on the huge screen, the propaganda posters, and the matching uniforms ordinary people seemed forced to wear, this Foundation seemed to be far more ruthless. They had transformed from a secretive organization into a full-blown authoritarian regime, maybe even in control of the entire world, ruling with an iron fist.
On your knees!
The commander of the mobile task force shouted again. The aggression in his voice, as well as the several laser pointers from his men's guns that were hovering over his chest, prompted Tommy to do as he was told.
Do you have anything to declare before we approach?
The MTF leader barked.
No.
Tommy stammered, before realizing that was probably an inadvisable answer. Yes, I'm SCP-507, but that number might refer to someone different here. Look, what I'm saying is this isn't my dimension, okay? I have a condition that sends me to different universes at random. I can't control it. It just happens. Please, for the love of God, don't shoot.
Better radio into command,
the team leader told one of his subordinates.
Tell them to run that number against the archives. Then inform Lord Adjudicator Clef that we may have a containment breach.
Overhearing what they were saying instantly reminded Tommy that he was still being chased.
Wait,
he called to the elite operatives.
There's something else you need to know. What's that, 507?
The commander sighed, lacking the patience for this. There's another anomaly after me, Tommy explained hurriedly. I don't know how long it'll take to get here, just that when it does, it'll kill everyone to get at me.
I've heard enough. Troopers, take him away.
The commander grunted. Two of the MTF team rushed up to Tommy and grappled either of his arms, not letting go despite his protests. They started dragging him towards their armored vehicle, looking like Tommy was about to spend the foreseeable future in the clutches of one of the worst versions of the Foundation. That is, until a tall, pale creature stepped out from behind the transport. The MTFs were instantly frenzied, and yells of another anomalous contact were quickly drowned out by the noise of gunfire. All the while, the shy guy was casually moving between the amassed troops, gripping their heads, twisting them all the way around, until a sickening crunch rang out. Dropped back to the ground, SCP-507 started to feel another headache coming on, knowing that any second, he'd displace again and end up in another alternate universe. And for the first time today, he was okay with that. It was better for their chase to go on if it meant that him and the shy guy didn't have to spend another minute in this universe. He's waiting for you in the dark. He sits cross-legged, still as a placid lake, and patient as a praying monk 6 feet deep in meditation. He's been like this for so long. His body oil slicked with deadly black grease, skin ancient and haggard, eyes black and flat with the kind of calm you'd only find in crawling insects and great white sharks. His lipless mouth is stretched across his jawbone in an ugly black rictus. He may be an old man, but trust us, he's got plenty of new tricks he'd love to show you. He sat in the loneliest place in the world, the deep, dark bowels of an SCP Foundation containment site, surrounded by a complex confluence of containment measures, different shapes, running liquids, bright lights, the kind of steel so thick a nuclear weapon would only leave it scuffed. All the things that had a tendency to confuse him, because that's all they ever did. The old man laughed to himself very quietly. All the people out there are so scared of him because of one immutable fact. He isn't trapped here, he's just resting. By virtue of his unique anomalous abilities to pass through solids at will and resist any form of physical damage they can dole out, there is no way to really contain him like all the others. All the SCP Foundation could hope to do was make leaving inconvenient enough for him to make his little adventures on the outside less appealing than just sitting around, doing nothing. After all, he had all the time in the world. And when you always have a later, there's a lot less pressure to do anything now. But like all thinking creatures, and please be aware that SCP-106, the wretched, terrifying old man, is very much a thinking creature, he was subject to occasional boredom. And when most people are bored, they might play a video game, watch a few YouTube videos, or rewatch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia for the 5th time. But for the old man, killing boredom involved, well, killing people. But not just killing people, of course. Truth be told, for him, killing was really the least entertaining part of the whole affair. The screams, the begging, the desperate pleas, warm tears on shaking cheeks, convulsions of pain, cold sweats, fear so intense it gives way to gibbering madness, the dull sheen of dead hope in their eyes when they realize that their doom is inevitable, and that he, their captor, their torturer, would decide the exact moment they slipped into the void. Oh, that was what he lived for. If you could call what the old man did living. He cracked his neck and licked his teeth. Was he salivating? All those thoughts about pain seemed to have got him worked up. He could feel the distant thumping of his heart, old black blood pumping through the dusty corridors of his vascular system, synapses booming and sparking with excitement at the thought of plumbing new depths of human misery. Like a scholar of suffering, a pioneer of pain. All those silly Foundation drones, with the audacity to think they're in control, he'd teach them to scream again. Meanwhile, in the room for the old man's containment chamber, all hell was breaking loose. Monitors on the monster's vitals were all spiking. Heart and brain activity peaked, just as they always did before the old man decided to get active. Cameras in his containment chamber showed him rising steadily to his feet, cracking his joints, limbering up. His body started to produce that terrible corrosive mucus at an accelerated rate, pooling around his feet and unleashing squalls of noxious fumes as it melted into the floor. Years of foundation testing, and they still couldn't find any material that could withstand that vile black slop. As the old man began strolling towards the wall, a containment specialist in the control room grabbed a nearby phone and sounded the alarm for the containment breach. They needed a mobile task force, and every guard on site mobilized to tackle 106 before he got into the facility proper and started causing havoc. They couldn't risk it escaping either. The infamous incident when the old man escaped for a Halloween massacre still haunted the nightmares of many a staff member. He had to be stopped. Now. A small fighting force was quickly armed and assembled, along with armor and several high-intensity portable lights to hopefully slow the monster down in time for them to grab a D-class and set up the femur breaker. By the time they all reached the hallway they intended to use as a choke point for the escape, the old man was already halfway through the outer layer of defense, phasing through the wall with that same terrible, manic grin he always had when he was about to inflict terrible violence for the sheer fun of it. The guards and task force members trained their lights and weapons on him. All of them had seen terrible things on the job, the kind of things that would saddle almost anyone with a lifetime of trauma, but almost nothing compared to the horror of direct engagement during a 106 containment breach. That terrible old coffin dodger was hell on two legs. When they discovered to their horror that the lights didn't seem to be slowing him down as much as anticipated, they fell back on Plan B. That B standing for blast the living hell out of him with everything they had. The personnel opened fire, pumping round after round into his dark form. While each gave a loud, meaty splatter, the old man didn't even flinch. When he was close enough, all those months of lethargy gave way to sudden, deadly speed. In many ways, the old man was like a crocodile, a fierce and intelligent ambush predator who conserved his energy wisely. He could seem so deceptively languid that you could easily mistake him for something slow and harmless, but when you got within arm's reach, the sudden quickness and ferocity would take you off guard, and by then, it's already too late. Within 30 seconds, the old man was the only thing left alive in that hallway. All the guards and task force operatives sent to slow him down lay dead, dripping with his black mucus. There was silence, save for the quiet fizzing of the mucus eating into their clothes and skin. The old man sighed. How boring. He'd killed so many people now. It all started to seem a little samey. How many screams could you hear before they all just blended into a single shrill whine? You can get sick of even your favorite meal if you eat it too often. But that didn't matter. The old man had a different order of business today. He happened to be inside an SCP Foundation containment facility, filled with so many fascinating specimens of non-human entities that the one they called SCP-106 simply couldn't wait to torture. He'd only met a small portion of the ones they had contained here, but given what a fascinating experience his past attack on his fellow anomalies was, he couldn't wait to meet some more. Meanwhile, the site's top brass did all they could to try to mobilize a second response to the rogue senior citizen from Hell currently strolling through their high-security containment facility. Could they get in contact with other mobile task forces deployed in the area? Maybe they could get Hammerdown or Samsara in on this mess before anything got really out of hand. The old man seemed more intent on something this time. They suspected even the femur breaker might not work in luring him back until he claimed whatever he deemed to be his prize. Maybe they should contact the O5 Council. Security guards were tracking 106's progress through the facility via their vast networks of security cameras. They warned any research, administration, and janitorial staff to clear out of his path, unless they felt like being tortured to death. He hadn't dragged anyone into his pocket dimension yet, so whoever that privilege was reserved for would probably be getting a particular sticky experience. They could only speculate as to the silent beast's intentions. One guard noticed something. When cross-referencing 106's movements with a map of the facility, they were able to triangulate where he was heading, straight for the containment chamber of SCP-096. The guard's lips curled into a slight smile, thinking, if one of you freaks can actually kill the other, maybe something positive will come out of this disaster. The old man was having a stroll down memory lane. The time prior, when he broke out of his cell and decided to hassle his fellow inmates, was certainly eventful. He wound up in the company of some cantankerous reptile and a Korean foxwoman, an unlikely pair if ever there was one. After finding himself in a room with them, he decided they should have a little more privacy and dragged them back into his pocket dimension for further fun. Of course, with two at once, his attention had been a little split. They spent as much time tussling with each other as resisting his attempts to torment them. They definitely put him through his paces that day, and he gave far better than he got. After so many hours of brutal mutilation, there was barely any of the lizard left, despite its frustrating insistence on quickly healing from so many of its wounds. Still, it was good exercise, even if the results had been a little less than satisfying. If he could get another anomaly alone, though, he'd be able to take his time and really savor the pain he caused. Oh, that sounded heavenly. Soon he came upon an incredibly strange containment chamber that quickly caught his eye. It looked like a huge metal cube with no way in or out, not even a seam. Whatever was trapped in there, the old man thought it must be something that even the fools at the SCP Foundation really, truly wanted nothing to do with. But even more so than the strange sight, it was the sound that drew the old man in, tempting him like a siren song. It was weeping, a soft, sobbing keen that betrayed a bottomless well of misery. Whatever was making that crying sound had known true despair, or whatever passes for true despair before you've had a close encounter with the old man in his pocket dimension. The old man grinned and thought,
"Oh, Sonny, I'll give you something to really cry about."
He stepped forward and phased his way into the metal cube. The creature was in the corner. In contrast to that stupid lizard, this monster was pleasingly humanoid, with, presumably, all the familiar pain points. Splendid. The only real difference was color and proportion. It was far longer and ganglier than the average human, with grayish skin and no hair anywhere on its body. Still, it was something the old man could work with. The creature didn't even seem to register his presence. It just sat crumpled in the corner, weeping. Still grinning his lunatic grin, the old man approached and rested a moist hand on the creature's shoulder. Its pale skin began to fizzle from the intruder's corrosive touch. A pool of vile sludge began spreading out beneath his feet until the creature was encompassed too. Little by little, they sank into the old man's favorite place out of the world, the pocket dimension, his own personal, eternal, infinite dungeon, where the only laws are pain and terror for all but the old man himself. Little did he know, this time, the scores may be a little more even on that front. They both stood in that terrifying labyrinth of hallways and chambers where the old man had made countless lives infinitely worse than any terrible afterlife that could follow them. And still, this creature didn't seem to change its reaction. He was almost irritated by it. And what's more, this whole time, the creature hadn't even turned to look at him. He'd have to fix that too. The old man, with his shocking strength, gripped the monster's shoulder and whipped him around, staring into his face, bearing his black eyes and manic smile. But he couldn't help find what looked back at him disconcerting. Its eyes were blank and white, its face stretched and warped into a permanent grimace, like Munch's old painting, The Scream. And the second the old man laid eyes on it, that's exactly what it did. Its gaping mouth let out the most terrible wail the old man had ever heard in all his years of torturing. It was a scream of unknowable sadness and fear, but somehow the old man sensed that this creature didn't fear him. It feared itself, feared what it was about to do. What the hell had he dragged down here with him? Without warning, the terrible wail soon gave way to sudden and ferocious aggression. Just like the old man had dealt out to a group of Foundation guards and mobile task force agents earlier that same night, it was only out of a mix of pure luck and his own finely tuned animal instinct that the old man was able to dodge the first strike from the creature's long, lithe forelimb. He couldn't believe it. They were in his special place, and this victim of his had the audacity to fight back? Well, he'd soon put this monster in its place. As the monster continued roaring and swiping for him, the old man simply walked backwards into a nearby wall disappearing into a black stain. Of course, the monster, better known to the Foundation as SCP-096 or the Shy Guy, simply crashed through the wall to give chase, but on the other side, just another wall. He disappeared. How? Typically, when something sees the face of the Shy Guy, he immediately has a kind of intuitive connection to them. He can sense their presence. It's burned into his mind, a homing beacon, an unstoppable imperative. He knows exactly where they are and how to get them. But nothing about this situation was typical. The Shy Guy felt all the murderous rage he normally did, but the rest was just static. Where was the life he needed to abolish hiding? Suddenly, the old man emerged behind him and forced his hand into the Shy Guy's back. His fist melted straight through flesh and skin, causing the creature to let out another terrible wail. But as could be expected, they didn't leave a scratch on the Shy Guy's indestructible skeleton. The Shy Guy pulled a 180 and swung for the old man again, but he was already gone. Here in the pocket dimension, the old man had the ultimate home turf advantage. Here, space and time were his playthings. In the infinite twisting, labyrinthian walls of the pocket dimension, the old man wasn't just the devil, he was God too. But it would take far more than some cheap tricks and bodily harm to dissuade the Shy Guy from his sole purpose in life. He began running through the old man's personal maze like a crazed lab rat, tearing through wall after wall, forever searching for the monster that trapped it here. He would see the smiling face of that rotten old man every so often, the flash of black eyes and dirty teeth in shadows. But every time it tried to strike the shadows, there would be nothing there. And every time he got a chance, the old man would emerge from the shadows behind the Shy Guy to strike back, clawing into his flesh and vanishing again before the trapped beast could retaliate. The nasty old sadist was now starting to have some fun. It was a reflex test, a classic game of high-stakes whack-a-mole, and every time the creature failed to strike him, its distress only seemed to grow. This was perfectly fine for the old man. After all, he enjoyed a little mental torment as much as he loved physical torture, and a human would have died or given in to despair long before now. This monster's wonderful mix of resilience and pain made it a great chew toy. The old man kept up this routine, baiting and striking until something unanticipated happened. He appeared, waited for the swing, disappeared as it approached, then reappeared behind the Shy Guy to deliver another painful strike. This time, however, it seemed his victim had anticipated his pattern. Before he could hit the creature, the Shy Guy turned, quicker than anything the old man had ever seen, and hit him with such force he flew through several walls in his own maze, shattering them as he went. He hit the ground, stunned by the fact that the Shy Guy had actually landed a hit, but he wasn't done. The shrieking monster came bounding after him. Before the old man could stand, it struck him again and again and again, pounding his vile body into the ground, which cracked and crumbled. The old man sneered and sank into a puddle of his mucus on the ground. The old man was gone again. SCP-096 screamed in a mix of rage, despair, and frustration, so consumed with its hunt that it didn't notice the pool of corrosive mucus was slowly growing. It began to rise, bubbling and hissing at SCP-096's feet, getting deeper and deeper and deeper as the walls rose taller and taller around it. The creature wailed until a tide of the awful stuff reached its face and cascaded down its throat, melting all the organs within. As the creature was fully submerged, SCP-106 manifested atop the wall and looked down, smiling spitefully. He thought,
"Oh, you may have had me there, boyo, but in the end, I always win. Nothing could survive that."
And yet bubbles still rose from the slop below. The old man gritted his rotten teeth and balled his fists in quiet anger. Moments later, back in our dimension, a portal opened in the ground of SCP-096's containment chamber. It vomited out SCP-096's skeleton, smothered in bubbling black goo, and SCP-106. 096 would probably be fully regenerated within a couple of hours, and if 682's encounter with him was anything to go by, probably extremely unwilling to interface with the old man. And the old man himself, who couldn't help but feel a little humiliated by the whole experience, was glad the two of them would probably never meet again. He left the regenerating 096 and commenced the walk of shame back to his containment chamber. They didn't even need the femur breaker. He just felt like having a sit-down and processing it all. Nobody else would ever know what happened in the pocket dimension that day. And for the old man's pride, that was probably for the best. But he'd know. He'd always know. By the night's end, he was sitting in his containment chamber again, forlornly wondering,
God damn it, old-timer. Have you lost your edge?
A group of well-armed Mobile Task Force members entered the containment chamber, armed to the teeth. Some faced the ground, droplets of sweat dripping onto their visors. Some wore Dr. Dan's infamous scramble goggles, and one particularly brave member of personnel wielded only a bag. The room they were currently standing in was perhaps the most dangerous place in the world. Why? Because it contained two terrifying titans of the anomalous world. SCP-682, the infinitely hateful, hard-to-destroy reptile, and SCP-096, the Shy Guy, the ultimate mindless killing machine. And if the very idea of having them in the same place doesn't feel risky enough, the deadly duo had just spent 27 hours in one of the most brutal brawls imaginable. And incidentally, fights like this are exactly why we're here today. We cover a lot of SCPs on this channel, and we've seen the way some of the most dangerous anomalies out there can tear their way through civilians and trained Foundation MTF operatives with ease. But how do they fare against monsters, maniacs, and reality benders their own size? With the help of the SCP Explained audience, we're going to explore theoretical fights between some of the anomalous world's biggest badasses. And who better to get this show on the road than two of the most iconic and deadly monsters that haunt the halls of a Foundation containment site near you. The hard-to-destroy reptile and the Shy Guy are household names for anyone familiar with the SCP Foundation. And before we get into the gruesome results of their first fight, and your theories about how a potential rematch might play out, let's get to know the combat prowess of this pair of nasty customers. What kind of damage are they capable of taking and inflicting? Spoiler alert, it's a hell of a lot. In this corner, we have SCP-682, a monster whose ability to survive seemingly anything is only equaled by its terrible attitude towards pretty much everyone and everything around it. Though, to be fair, you'd probably be a little grumpy too if the SCP Foundation was constantly trying to murder you in different ways, rather than just keeping you contained. 682's basic offensive power set involves impressive strength, speed, intelligence, and the aid of its deadly fangs, claws, and tail. However, 682 is considerably stronger after it's just survived and regenerated from a termination attempt. That's because the true combat asset of 682 is and always has been its adaptability. Specifically, if some kind of attack brings 682 into a state of near death, but doesn't finish the job, 682 will generally either develop a perfect defense or counteroffensive for that attack or somehow add a version of the attack to its own arsenal. This has ranged from super pressurized jets of its own blood, dangerously radioactive banana beams firing out of its mouth, and even an incapacitating laughter blast gained from an encounter with the adorable SCP-999. It is an absolute Swiss Army knife of dangerous anomalous powers and abilities. And if you need any further proof of that, check out our multiple videos on all the ludicrous failed attempts to kill this nightmare lizard. And in this corner, we've got SCP-096, the Shy Guy. While 682 is freakishly adaptable, in most situations SCP-096 is pretty much unstoppable. This long, gangly creep will murder anyone who sees even the tiniest glimpse of its face, with such ferocity that not even a trace of the body will remain. It does this by entering what many call its rage state, activated by the sudden immense distress of its face being seen. When it enters this state, the SCP Foundation has only one prerogative: get themselves and anyone else out of its way, because you will not stop this thing until it's killed its target. All the SCP Foundation has ever been able to do is wait until after the target has been obliterated, and then come in to bag its head when it enters its docile state. Almost nothing else has even successfully slowed it down. While they have been capable of damaging its flesh, the monster's skeleton seems to be utterly indestructible, and its damaged flesh has proven consistently able to grow back. The monster seems to be immune to everything from pain to cold, and moves at such a speed that it's pretty much impossible to escape for long. So when you factor in an indestructible body, immense strength, immense speed, and an unstoppable urge to kill anyone who sees its face, you're looking at a formidable opponent. It's only natural that the Foundation would want to use 096 in their 682 cross tests. So what exactly happened when the Mobile Task Force entered the room after this first epic battle? What did they find inside the chamber in the grisly aftermath? SCP-096 lay crumpled in the corner, wheezing, scared, covered in its own blood. 682 was barely recognizable. 096 had reduced it to a quarter of its original size, the rest having been utterly torn to shreds. Both had narrowly survived the encounter, but it was an epic battle neither of them would ever forget. Though this was especially true for SCP-096. You see, as we alluded to earlier, SCP-682 is used to taking a kicking at this point. It hasn't ever truly been killed, but it's been beaten, eaten, burned, zapped, and smashed within an inch of its life more times than you can count. 096, on the other hand, was not used to not being able to utterly eliminate its prey. While it is impossible to speculate what's going on inside SCP-096's mind, all evidence points towards getting a draw in this battle, seriously damaging SCP-096's confidence. Now, every time Foundation personnel tries to bring 096 into 682's containment chamber, he begins crying and scratching at his own face. Why? Is he scared of 682? Is he humiliated, thinking of the fight he wasn't able to win? Or is the very idea of someone seeing his face and him not being able to immediately kill them just too unbearably stressful? Seeing as the Shy Guy's mouth is only good for two things and neither of them are for talking, we'll never truly know. But either way, it's clear that 096 has no interest in a rematch. But what if that changed? What if 096 realized that it was wasting its potential? It managed to get SCP-682 3/4 of the way to death last time. What could stop it from getting that last quarter? Sure, nothing has ever killed SCP-682 before, but there's a first time for everything, right? Maybe 096 would have a Rocky-style training montage where he rebuilds his confidence and becomes the underdog he was always meant to be. He'd walk right up to that big nasty reptile and give him the rematch of the century. What would happen then? Now we give the floor to you, the loyal viewers of SCP Explained. Here are some of your thoughts, theories, and opinions on a potential historic rematch between these two creeps. Let's get ready to rumble! I really wanted an excuse to say that. Ooh, I really like saying that. Pingu with an axe said, if 682's adaptability is based around his ability to develop countermeasures to any damage inflicted, or in the case of 173, a countermeasure to the cause of said damage, I imagine 682 would turn his skin entirely reflective, causing 096 to see his own face and the feedback loop would break his mind. Interesting. Whether this would work is all dependent on whether SCP-096 can actually see, or if it is merely capable of psychically intuiting when someone else sees its face. If the latter is true, then this particular adaptation wouldn't do much good for SCP-682. Random user said, if this is after their first cross-test and they were forced to interact again, they wouldn't attempt to fight each other. I feel like they'd form a truce and take out the researchers on site. Yeah, this would be one of the worst-case scenarios. Whether even the SCP Foundation could handle a simultaneous 682 and 096 breach without bringing in Hammerdown is an open question. Ramon Vonkin said, simple, after the first encounter when 096 stopped attacking 682, 682 will grow eyes that filter out 096's face the next time. Organic scramble goggles. Dr. Dan would be fuming with jealousy. Coop Sater said, I really want SCP-096 to win, so I'm sending him a blind personal trainer so he can beat the snot out of SCP-682. This is exactly the kind of help SCP-096 needs. He's got the rage, endurance, and strength. With a little help getting his form and technique in order, he'd be an even more formidable opponent. Kyoto Ryo said, I'd like to imagine 096, after playing with 682 for so long, would try to eat 682 in a vain attempt to kill it, only to gain 682's abilities and vice versa. Either of these options would be horrifying. SCP-096 with 682's abilities or 682 with 096's abilities would likely be a truly perfect killing machine. That's terrifying. Autumn said, what if they just shared a nice cold drink while playing Mario Kart? I'm sure 096 would be the white Shy Guy character in every race. Personally, we love this idea, and we think 682 would go for Bowser. I personally go for Luigi. Ibrahim Timur said, 682 would win eventually. It's way more intelligent, adaptive, and overall malicious, while 096 acts just on instinct. This is undeniably a good point. What 682 lacks in sheer savagery, it makes up for in its ruthless calculating intelligence. Could this give it the edge over 096? Monomoy Mukherjee said, that fight would be interesting because both of them now know how they attack and what their attacks are. Nice segue. Due to the relatively mindless nature of 096, as far as we're aware, it's probably unable to learn from experience. 682, however, would have the advantage of knowing how 096 operates in the second battle. Devon Smith said, "As much as I'd like to see how this would play out, I imagine 096 can't manage more than other SCPs have in the past. Not to downplay him, but he might need some extra friends to do a whole lot more damage." It's undeniable that going in with tag team partners would better 096's chances of taking the lizard down. However, due to SCP-096's shyness and tendency to kill everyone and everything that looks at him, he doesn't have many friends looking to volunteer. Ninetales said, 096 will cry in the corner while 682 starts attacking it. Eventually, it gets confused that 096 isn't fighting back after an hour and begins to adapt to it and becomes docile forever. Okay, look, while it's unlikely that this would happen, it's certainly nice to imagine, isn't it? Adam Britton said, narratively it needs to conclude with a reason to never try it again. So I'm going to say that 682 will telepathically project the image of 096 into the site staff or the entire human psychospace. Ugh, yikes. This is a possibility so terrifying and honestly plausible that it's making us regret wanting to see this rematch altogether. Chaos Insurgency said, I think 682 would just think, for damn sake, just leave me alone. Given he's been through more termination attempts than SCP-5031 can count on its fingers, who could blame him for getting a little frustrated? Michael Porter said, I think that 682 and 096 would take each other to court for aggravated assault against the other. Either one of them will get sentenced to death and will unsurprisingly not die, or the two team up to kill the entire courtroom and they walk out as a new serial killing team. The real question is what kind of lawyers would represent a pair of murderous, anomalous monsters in court? Better call Saul. Ari Workman said, maybe if we try being nice to them for once, we can offer them a cup of tea and get them both a therapist. 682 will talk all his hate away and then realize his wrongdoing and become an activist. And 096 would become very confident about his face and become a model. There, problem solved. Hey, when people strive towards self-improvement, we're all winners. But we don't know if we can say the same for 682 and 096. Even if this rematch ever did happen, perhaps it'd be just another draw. An unstoppable force against an immovable object. But other matchups may be more clear-cut. What kind of versus battles would you like to see us cover in the future? What SCPs would you really love to see duke it out? Let us know in the comments, and keep an eye out on the community posts in order to throw in your anomalous 2 cents for our next versus battle.
What does a monster look like to you? What figures slither and claw their way into your nightmares, chasing you down endless halls and stalking you through the dark until you wake up screaming? Maybe you imagine something tall and lean, bony arms reaching for you from atop impossibly long, slender legs, its featureless face showing no mercy. Maybe you think of a man in a striped sweater with knives for fingers, or a serial killer in a hockey mask, wielding a machete. Maybe it's something more inhuman, a cosmic horror of tentacles and eyes that can see into your very soul. You probably don't think of something with no arms, no legs, no body at all, just a face. What's so scary about that? A face can't run after you, can't grab you by the ankles and pull you under the bed. A face can only look. It may be unsettling to behold, it might send a chill down your spine, but the worst it can do is make you a little uncomfortable. And if you can't stand it any longer, you could always just close your eyes or walk away and be done with it, right? If that's what you think, if you don't believe in monsters that can hurt you without lifting a finger, then you're the type to fall victim to a very special, very intelligent mask. In the hollowed halls of the SCP Foundation, there is a containment cell, outfitted with a hermetically sealed glass case, surrounded by steel, iron, and lead. There are guards posted outside, along with a trained psychologist. If you are ever brave and foolish enough to enter that room, you'll see a simple white porcelain comedy mask with a peculiar black substance leaking from its eyes and mouth. Whatever this slime touches, surfaces begin to corrode, to rot away into puddles of black liquid. You might notice the same liquid trickling slowly down the walls of the room, corrupting everything in its path.
As unsettling of a sight as it is, if you approach the mask to take a closer look, you will find yourself overcome by an intense, nearly irresistible urge to pick it up and put it on, to wear it, to let it consume you from the inside out and puppet your body while your brain simply turns off. Like an extinguished flame, you'll simply be gone. Then, who knows what the mask will do? It won't be your concern anymore, that's for sure. But thankfully, you haven't gone into the room with the porcelain mask. You haven't let it cast its spell on you. Not yet, at least. It's waiting for you there, in the room with black slime oozing down its walls, and it will wait patiently for as long as it needs to. After all, what's a mask without a face to wear it? SCP-035, better known as the Possessive Mask, sat in its containment cell, immobile as always. It didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. The Foundation had chosen, selfishly, to revoke its host privileges. Once upon a time, they offered it bodies to choose from. Mannequins, dummies, and wooden dolls it could adorn and pilot. They didn't last as long as an organic living host, of course, but it was something. It was a taste of freedom. This dreadful new situation was almost enough to make the mask want to change its surroundings. This dreadful new situation was almost enough to make the mask want to change its expression from comedy to tragedy, but it was determined to still find something to laugh about. Even without a body trapped in this infernal box, there had been some delicious opportunities for entertainment. Human minds were fragile things. The mask had learned this over the infinite years of its life, if one could call it a life. Apply the right kind of pressure to the right weak points, whisper an enticing word or two, find the right emotional wound to sprinkle a pinch of salt into, and humans would buckle completely in almost no time at all. It had tried all sorts of methods since being confined to this boring little box. Sometimes it would charm someone, pour honeyed flattery into their heads until the person felt like the mask was a dear friend, a confidant. Once suitable trust had been built up, the mask could persuade the person to bring it a host, or perhaps even offer up themselves in sacrifice. If flattery didn't work, there were other potent approaches to take. For a being without ears, the mask was a good listener. It picked up on things that no human ever could, the darkest secrets buried in a person's mind. If it caught wind of something, especially juicy and ruinous, it could leverage that, threaten to expose an affair, a crime, or perhaps something even worse, something unspeakable. If praise failed, and so did blackmail, there was always good old supernatural intimidation. All the mask needed was for someone to be left alone with it for a long enough period of time. Then its invisible tendrils could snake out into their defenseless mind, weaving and poking around, leaving a lingering sense of cold, dread, of incomprehensible whispers in long, dead tongues. What a delight containment had been in the early days, when the Foundation had not yet figured out the mask's true capabilities, when they would leave security personnel with weak wills and minimal training standing guard in the mask's field of influence for hours at a time, as the entity played with their thoughts and chipped away at their free will. Thanks to the helpers it had been able to mold out of those hapless victims, they had been there to break open its case and carry it to freedom. But every time, the other guards thwarted the attempts, shooting its helpers and rendering them utterly useless. Then the Foundation increased its security. Something about the unacceptably high homicide rates among staff assigned to SCP-035. How utterly boring. How truly pathetic. Still, the mask had found ways to occupy itself even without any more playthings. It had grown stronger with its boredom, stretching its influence beyond organic beings and into the very room itself, its evil enriching and deepening. like a fine wine in the depths of a cold cellar. Over the months, the walls of SCP-035's containment cell had begun to secrete the same black, slimy substance that would pour from the mask's eyes and mouth. The liquid dripped down the walls in deliberate formations, patterns that became increasingly easy to recognize. Phrases in Italian, Latin, Ancient Greek, all detailing ritual sacrifices and mutilations. The mask took time to describe the sacrificial victims in great detail, borrowing identifying traits from various staff members that it knew would read the translations. The walls were slick with blood and harrowing imagery, and the glass case around the mask was growing more and more fragile by the day. Anyone within 10 meters of the mask could feel this strength too. They would leave the area complaining of unintelligible whispers, of loud, cruel laughter, and a lingering sense of nearly insurmountable despair. It was as if they knew on some level that no one was truly safe. Eventually, the mask would find a way to come for them all. The glass was weakening, and soon the mere thought of escape would make it shatter into pieces. Then, perhaps, the mask could finally get its deepest desire: revenge. It wanted nothing more than to try to make the Foundation pay for imprisoning it, for taking away its host privileges, for trying harder and harder to contain the kind of power that should have had them falling to their knees in worship. The mask seethed with hatred day in and day out. It had seen the crumbling of the Roman Empire, the beheading of kings, the decimation of armies. It was not going to be captured by a bunch of rats in lab coats without dire consequences befalling them. Maybe it couldn't move from its prison cell at the moment, but it also knew that it was surrounded on all sides by dangerous beasts capable of reducing the sight and all who had dared to oppose the mask to a pile of smoldering rubble. If it could only find its way onto one of their faces, it would show them all just what it was capable of. As the piercing sound of an alarm echoed down the hall, the sound of screams and chaos following shortly after, the mask's frowning face curved into a broad, menacing smile. What was it that had escaped? The lizard, perhaps? The giant grinning man? Whatever it was, it seemed that the action was heading right towards 035's containment cell. Perhaps today was the day. Finally, the SCP Foundation would fall. Outside the masked cell, Security Officer Harper was running for dear life. Though his more rational mind knew he was living on seconds, not even minutes, of borrowed time, his animal brain kept his legs pumping, desperately trying to avoid the screaming, howling predator hot on his heels. Harper looked over his shoulder and screamed as a long white arm reached for him. SCP-096, the Shy Guy, its tooth-lined jaw hanging low and foaming with spittle. That face, that terrible, terrible face. An absolute death sentence to all who saw it. He'd seen what he thought was a crack in the otherwise perfect seal of 096's containment chamber, but it could have just as easily been a trick of the light. Not even thinking, he stepped forward and looked at the vulnerability in the chamber. All it took was one misplaced ray of light, and he made out the vague shape of a face in the darkness. That's when the weeping started. Harper knew in that moment his life was over. The correct thing to do would have been to order everyone else in the room to close their eyes while he stood there and accepted his fate, minimizing the risk of spreading the damage further. But humans rarely have perfect reasoning, even less so when facing mortality. Back in the present, the Shy Guy made a perfect lunge, grabbing Harper in its iron clutches and barreling through the adjoining wall. The nearby guards scattered, terrified, keeping their eyes on the floor. They might get a slap on the wrist for temporarily abandoning their posts, but they weren't going to die guarding some stupid, evil mask. Speaking of, the possessive mask was surprised to feel two new presences enter its chamber through the now destroyed wall. These two presences soon became just one, as SCP-096 quickly and totally annihilated Security Officer Harper leaving nothing left. The mask couldn't see per se, seeing as it had no actual sensory organs, but it felt around this new guest with its many psychic tendrils, taking in this strange totality. The creature was powerful, no doubt about that, and it elicited fear from those fools at the SCP Foundation, but the mask noticed its brainwaves were extraordinarily muted. Humans, to the mask's vast and malicious consciousness, weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, but compared to this thing's mind, they were a pile of tempered katanas. It barely thought at all. The mask would have to dig deeper to find anything it could use. Meanwhile, SCP-096 finally began to calm down. The one who had seen it had been annihilated. Bubbling rage was slowly siphoned out and replaced by the standard low but constant hum of anxiety and despair. It would wait until its head was bagged and it was dragged back to the dark. Same old, all the way to the end of time. That's when it felt something else. It started as a faint buzz, an unintelligible whisper, and it was almost like a door opened in the back of its head. Something stepped in and took a seat.
Can you hear me, stranger? Look. I want to speak to you.
Something about the voice frightened and comforted SCP-096 at the same time. It spoke with a greater degree of sympathy than the creature had heard in a long time. And yet, something about the way it spoke implied evil in its intent.
I know what you want. I know what you fear. Wouldn't it be nice if they could never look at you again? If you could cover that face of yours, I can help you. It will be so simple. All you need to do is put me on.
Little by little, 096 felt more of these strange thoughts filling up the emptiness in its head, replacing the few little thoughts the creature itself had. It felt itself lifting its hands from the ground, lifting them and reaching towards something, a glass box. The glass shattered, and those long white fingers reached for something within. A mask, just like the voice had said. A mask to stop people from looking at its face.
Yes. You're doing so well. You're so close. Just a little further.
SCP-096 lifted the mask to its face, feeling black liquid that burned its skin dripping from the porcelain, and put it on. And in that moment, everything changed. The Shy Guy's body began to seize up, rattling as the mask unleashed a web of psychic tendrils through its body, mapping out across every inch like a new nervous system, taking control. The possessive mask had never experienced a host like this before. That incredible, perfect mix of physical durability and a mind so insubstantial that it was easy to sublimate.
Oh, this was going to be fun.
For the first time, the Shy Guy, now under the full control of the possessive mask, stood at full height on its hind legs, its spine and shoulders clicking into place for its new stance. The mask cracked its neck, getting used to the new dimensions of its physicality, its indestructible bones, its long, grasping limbs, its skin burning and fizzling with the gooey black secretions, but growing back just as quickly. The Foundation had every reason to fear it now. A group of security personnel had gathered in the ragged hole where the chamber's north wall used to be. Some were wielding light firearms. The guard at the front was carrying an opaque black bag. The mask laughed with its new body and turned to the crowd. The second they saw it on 096's body, their faces fell. For a moment, their bodies went slack with terror. This situation was unprecedented. What course of action could they possibly take at a time like this? It looked at the bag held by the leader of the security force and projected a single thought into his mind.
You won't be needing that.
Before any of the guards even had a chance to open fire, the mask lunged forwards, using the long, terrible arms of the Shy Guy to tear through the guards. They were dead in seconds, their bodies strewn about the hallway. The mask's porcelain was twisted into a wide, sadistic grin. It could tell that it was about to have some real fun around here. And once it slaughtered everyone here, it could finally stretch its legs out in the open again. True freedom to spread misery, fear, and pain everywhere it went. There were just a few hundred members of Foundation personnel it needed to turn into corpses first. More containment breach alarms sounded around the site as the mask began its rampage, running through the hallways and tearing apart any unfortunate Foundation personnel it could get 096's hands on. Guards, researchers, administrative staff, and even one extremely unlucky janitor in hallway C6. It was having the time of its long and terrible life, and much to its glee, it seemed that this new host's body was still holding up. It was perfect symbiosis, a twisted, brilliant mind, and a body that could forever support it. There would be no stopping it. A conclusion that the hapless guards posted around the site soon realized on their own terms. 096 was indestructible, but it was dumb as a brick and had an easily exploitable weakness. Get the bag on its head and you're home free. This new composite creature was a different story. It could think tactically, avoiding head-on confrontations in favor of sneak attacks, and the monster had as much psychic combat potential as physical. Guards roving the building in teams heavily armed with anti-mimetic protective gear still reported feeling immense feelings of psychological dread over comms. That was the greatest sign that the mask would come bursting through the wall moments later and tear them to shreds. The site director put out an urgent call for all nearby mobile task forces to intercept and help them take care of the unfortunate situation. Thankfully, a detachment of MTF 810, also known as See No Evil, was operating on a case in close proximity. Given their specialization in anomalies with a mimetic visual property, many on the team had dealt with 096 breaches before. That at least gave them experience in half of this situation, and one operative among them, Sergeant Enrique Ramirez, would be the one to bring this nightmare to an end, but it would cost him his life in the process. The mask was still using its new indestructible body to wreak havoc on the containment site. Once it had taken out the primary contingents of guards, it was free to have its fun with the rest, stalking defenseless researchers through the halls, making sure to induce maximum terror before finally striking the killing blow. Every single one of them died with a head full of demonic whispers. It told them of the mask's eternal dominion. Now it had found the perfect host. Nothing on Earth would stop it. Humans would be mere ants under its feet. 810 touched down and entered the building. Ramirez was point man, leading the others into the bowels of the blood-drenched containment site. They'd been briefed on what they were heading in for. 096 and 035 had reached symbiosis and were displaying unprecedented anomalous effects. Enter with extreme caution. They're beyond dangerous, even more so together than alone. Ideally, Ramirez would have wanted to go in with a comprehensive plan, but lives were on the line here. They needed to leap off the cliff and build their wings on the way down. It was only when they finally encountered the monster that they realized just how outmatched they were. Despite their best efforts, the combined speed, intelligence, and ferocity of the mask's new form allowed it to make short work of 810. Only Ramirez was left, heavily injured. Even if a miracle happened, he knew he wasn't getting out of here alive. The mask grabbed him with one of 096's claws and lifted him up. It would take its time with this one. Make him suffer, watch him squirm, destroy his mind. Ramirez felt the mask's psychic tendrils penetrate the membrane of his mind. Those whispers, those terrible whispers reciting all his worst fears with terrible glee. His gun was out of ammo. His knife was broken. All he had left on him was a pocket mirror, and that was his eureka moment. It was a long shot, but it was also his only shot. He reached out and grabbed the bottom of the mask, pulling for dear life. His other hand shot into his pocket and grabbed the mirror, opening its lid with a deft flick of his thumb. It was too fast for the mask to even register what was going on. Ramirez forced his eyes shut and lifted up the mirror. The mask saw its own reflection in the glass as the bottom of its face came loose, revealing the reflection of the face underneath. The mask squeezed, killing Ramirez, but it was already too late. It had finally seen the face of its host, and that would cost it dearly. The mask felt a sudden and tremendous pushback to its psychic forces, a blind despair and then rage that choked out everything. SCP-096 began to sob and howl. Somehow the mask was no longer in control. Despite its psychic protests, 096 reached up and tore the terrible mask from its face, tossing it against the wall with such force that it was embedded in the brickwork. Its last thoughts, as other mobile task force operators descended on the area to bag 096 and return it to its containment chamber, were, "What the hell just happened?" And the next thought that crossed the mind of the site director was, "Request site transfer for 035 as soon as possible. Don't want a repeat of this incident anytime soon." Well, hello there, SCP fans. Let's get this out of the way first. You've seen the title and thumbnail, and you're probably wondering, wait, is Siren Head an SCP? And the answer is no. Siren Head is not an SCP. It's a freaky internet monster created by renowned Canadian horror artist Trevor Henderson. Your next question is probably, what's with this crazy-looking server bank behind me? Allow me to introduce you to the Anomatron 6000, the latest advancement of supercomputing owned and operated exclusively by the SCP Foundation. It's capable of a whole bunch of interesting features, calculating ideal containment methods, running state-of-the-art Foundation web crawler software, making and editing fun SCP YouTube videos. But the most interesting feature that the Anomatron has to offer is running hyper-advanced simulations regarding all things anomalous, with data fed into it by thousands of real-life experiments conducted by the SCP Foundation. It's going to save countless dollars and lives for Foundation researchers, but way more importantly, it's going to let us explore all kinds of weird and wacky what-if scenarios that would never happen organically. Could SCP-343 beat Goku or Superman? Who's a deadlier supernatural killer? SCP-106 or Freddy Krueger? Would the world simply explode from adorableness if SCP-999 and Baby Yoda ever crossed those multiversal barriers and met? We can explore all of these questions, along with any others you may have down in the comments. Seriously, comment it, we dare you. But to get things started, we figured we'd make the Anomatron pit the Foundation's lankiest nightmare monster, SCP-096, against the internet's, Trevor Henderson's, Siren Head. Sorry, Slenderman, you're just not cool anymore. So without further ado, let's kick the Anomatron into gear and see how this wild battle plays out. It's time for SCP-096 vs. Siren Head. Ricky and Elliot, a pair of aspiring travel YouTubers from California, were taking a vacation to the Pacific Northwest to spend some time in the area's beautiful lush forests. However, while the duo were both big fans of travel for its own sake, they weren't just here for the trees and fresh air. You see, despite their jet-setting lifestyle, Ricky and Elliot's subscribers and views hadn't exactly been phenomenal lately. Turns out hiking vlogs and GoPro footage of the two of them jumping into absurdly blue water in Bali weren't exactly that interesting to people who weren't actually there. But Ricky had formulated an ingenious plan to pull the two of them out of obscurity. They would hunt down and film real footage of the legendary Siren Head, a supernatural monster said to haunt forests and isolated graveyards. There were plenty of fakers out there on YouTube, but if the two of them could get real footage of Siren Head, and also preferably survive the experience, they'd be framing their golden play buttons in no time. But they were already encountering certain issues. For starters, the two Californians had severely underestimated just how cold it was in the Pacific Northwest, and as such, were already shivering from bone-deep cold. The second issue was food. While the two of them had thought ahead and brought a selection of tasty protein bars, they'd also gotten hungry during the early hours of their walk and eaten all of them, leaving them feeling severely out of luck by the time dinner rolled around. And the third and perhaps most problematic issue of all was the fact that Ricky and Elliot didn't exactly have a great sense of direction. During all of their previous trips, they'd been on guided tours with local experts. In this instance, wanting to take all the Siren Head glory and clout for themselves, they decided to come in alone, with the incredibly janky Google Maps app to guide them. As such, as the night was creeping in, the two aspiring YouTube celebrities had no idea where they were. Needless to say, it wasn't exactly an ideal situation. And to make matters worse, Ricky and Elliot had been experiencing some strange feelings for the last couple of hours when they'd gotten particularly deep into the forest. That dread-inducing sensation of being watched by something lurking just out of sight, a gaze with some unknowable and darkly malicious intent boiling behind it. These two poor saps had no idea what was in store for them tonight. And wouldn't you know it, the one watching them right now wouldn't even be the only monster after them. After an expectable amount of bumbling and buffoonery, Ricky and Elliot managed to gather up enough tinder to make a semi-respectable campfire. They could sleep out here tonight, then set off in search of Siren Head or civilization, whichever came first, in the daylight the next day. The duo did what they could to remain chipper in spite of the ominous circumstances. Sure, they were trapped in the depths of the woods alone, but think of the amazing vlog footage they'd get. They'd be like the next Blair Witch crew, except they'd live, hopefully. But as the duo sat next to their campfire, they felt that ominous sensation again. The hairs on the back of their necks started standing up. They felt shivers that didn't just come from the cold. More and more they started to feel certain that something in this forest was watching them, something ancient and powerful and evil. That's when they heard the telltale crackle of radio static, and their skeletons almost jumped out of their skin. Could it be him, the patron saint of gone missing without a trace, of creeping dread, of bad things coming? Siren Head himself. Both men fell silent. All they could hear was the crackling of their own fire. Had the sound before just been an illusion? A product of a pair of paranoid minds also predisposed to sense siren-headed monsters lurking amongst the trees. They'd been reading about a higher rate of disappearances in this area, along with a number of frightening sightings of tall, thin beings and radio static that seemed perfectly consistent with Siren Head activity. That's why they'd come here in the first place. But had they come here to their deaths? The two needed to distract themselves, or they'd go mad from the paranoia. They decided to share a few fun little anecdotes of the travels they'd had before meeting one another, showing the photos they'd saved on their smartphones. Ricky had been to Hawaii, Tahiti, Bora Bora, Fiji, St. Lucia, and the Maldives. Clearly, he liked his vacations warm and sandy. Elliot, on the other hand, tended to like his trips to be a little more adventurous. He'd seen volcanoes, waterfalls, deep and treacherous cave systems, and, of course, a little guided mountaineering. One photo that Elliot showed Ricky was particularly breathtaking. He was standing in the foreground of a snowy landscape, with an incredible mountain range behind him. When Ricky asked Elliot where exactly he'd taken this picture, strangely enough, he drew a complete blank. Maybe somewhere in Canada or Siberia or something like that. But it was a hell of a trip, whatever the case. He remembered having a great time. It was such a tiny detail, but when looking at the photo, Ricky couldn't help but notice something in the background, a speck of white. Sure, not exactly newsworthy in the snowy mountain range, but this wasn't snow. It was a speck of white that seemed to be a slightly different shade than the rest of the mountain. Strange. Perhaps it was just some tiny particle stuck on the lens whenever the photo was taken. The two continued to chat and warmed their hands against the fire, having no idea of the horror they'd just awoken in doing so. Over 100 miles away, at an SCP Foundation containment site, researchers and guards walked around the perimeter of a huge airtight metal cube, reading off diagnostics and audio recordings. For reasons that should be obvious to everyone who's a fan of this channel, there were no camera feeds coming from the inside of the great metal cube. Only a faint whimpering sound, like a sad, wounded animal, and the clanking of pacing feet moving back and forth over the metal, dragging forlorn knuckles. It turned every head in the room when the crying started to get louder. Soon it wasn't just quiet weeping, it was a series of horrendous, slobbering sobs, wails of pure pain and despair. Someone in the room screamed, "Close your eyes and hit the deck!" knowing exactly what had happened. They learned well enough from the infamous Incident 096-1-A containment breach that there was no way of stopping this thing until it run its course. The best they could do was minimize their own fatalities in the process. Everyone in the room did as they were told, hitting the ground, closing their eyes, and covering them with their hands just to be safe. That's when the solid steel of the cube was torn open like crepe paper, and the howling, raging SCP-096 broke free, galloping on all fours through the nearest wall, shattering it, and spraying debris everywhere. As mobile task forces were dispatched to track the rampaging abomination and try their best to clear the path ahead as it sought out its target, one thought was going through the minds of everyone in the room. Woe betide the poor fools who saw that monster's face. Back in the deep dark forests of the Pacific Northwest, the presence of some unnerving force was becoming far harder to deny for Ricky and Elliot. They heard the sounds of garbled voices out in the woods, the squeals and crackles of radio static. They saw shapes moving amongst the trees, tall and thin, like long, spindly limbs. While neither wanted to voice their fear, they were both thinking similar things. If there really was a monster out here, why hadn't it killed them? It had all the time in the world to do it. But that was just it, wasn't it? It had all the time in the world, so why rush? It had every advantage. It could take its time and do this exactly how it wanted to. Ricky and Elliot had made themselves the perfect prey, and as they saw a huge, lithe figure suddenly separate itself from the trees, they began to wonder if it was really worth it to risk both of their lives for YouTube clout. Either way, it was now probably too late for regrets. Ricky and Elliot's jaws fell in horror as the monster emerged from the darkness before them. They recognized the awful, mottled skin stretched over the monster's 40-foot frame. They saw the grasping hands, and up above, the nightmarish faceless head split into a pair of sirens pointing in different directions, each one filled with gnashing teeth and slithering tongues. It was even more terrifying than they could possibly have imagined. Siren head speakers crackled into life and hissed out,
9, 18, 1, child, 17, remove, vile.
Ricky and Elliot stumbled backwards as Siren Head advanced, its speakers still bleeding hateful static. Neither could move or speak, only watch as its long, gnarled fingers reached from the dark to grasp them. There was a terrible pained wail in the woods after that, but it wasn't coming from Ricky, Elliot, or Siren Head. It was distant at first, but soon became louder and louder as the force's point of origin came barreling towards them. Even Siren Head couldn't help but turn to see SCP-096, a flash of terrible white fury, come charging towards them in the dark, knocking down all the trees in its path. Leaves and pine needles scattered, trunks exploded into splinters. Nothing would stop the Shy Guy from claiming its prey. Nothing would stop it from destroying Ricky. And now as it approached, Elliot made the fatal mistake of looking at its face, too. 096 lunged, ready to go in for the kill when Siren Head's hands closed around the Shy Guy's slender torso. In one fluid motion with surprising strength for its scrawny build, it hurled the Shy Guy into the distance, smashing another several trees in its path. The words,
My prey, mine,
hissed out of its speakers. But 096 was only down for mere moments. It sprung back up on its hind and forelegs and started galloping towards Ricky and Elliot again, who were still frozen in place. This time, just before the Shy Guy's terrible claws could close around the two hapless wannabe YouTubers, down came Siren Head's clenched fist, pounding 096's head into the dirt. Overhead, mobile task force helicopters circled, wearing their scramble goggles and trying to get a visual on the situation unfolding below. They could hardly believe what they were seeing down there. Was some other unclassified anomaly managing to intercept 096 in its rage state? Only a handful of anomalies on record have ever been shown of being capable of such a feat. It seemed that they were dealing with something serious here. Down below, the battle continued. Siren Head had a unique advantage over most other combatants facing SCP-096. It was an extra-dimensional being with no eyes, merely an innate psychic awareness of its victims around it. Not unlike how SCP-096 detect people seeing its face in photographs or videos, without need for any kind of direct contact. As such, it was impossible for Siren Head to see the Shy Guy's face, and thus impossible for the Shy Guy to ever actually direct its aggression against it. Whether or not 096 would kill steal Siren Head's intended prey was another matter entirely. In the night's first minor miracle, Ricky and Elliot remembered that they'd been born with working legs and decided that right now would be an excellent time to use them. They turned and began to run while Siren Head continued beating the Shy Guy into the dirt, sprinting with all their might. However, the growing distance between them only aggravated the Shy Guy further. It sprang out from the dirt with unstoppable force and broke away from Siren Head's grip. The Shy Guy never wasted time, ever. It always made a beeline for its intended victim with one directive in mind: total annihilation. Tonight is no different. Ricky and Elliot screamed as they heard its pounding gallop on the ground behind them. Closer, closer, closer. Then suddenly, defying all spatial reasoning, Siren Head emerged out from the darkness between Ricky, Elliot, and 096. Being 40 feet tall, Siren Head dwarfed even the Shy Guy. It lunged and grabbed the wailing white monstrosity, holding it as one would a particularly vicious cat, and trying to keep it in place. Siren Head wanted to crush the monster's bones and carry on stalking its feeble human prey, who were currently in the process of getting away, but somehow that was impossible. It was almost like the monster had an indestructible skeleton. Up above, the mobile task forces continued observing this clash of the Titans from their 2 helicopters. Seeing how Siren Head was somehow doing a serviceable job of subduing the Shy Guy, one of the task force members joked, "Maybe we should hire this guy." Another chimed in, "I don't think we have any ballistic vests in his size." The laughter soon turned to screams when Siren Head hurled 096's flailing body up at one of the helicopters with incredible force, knocking it out of the sky. It careened down to the ground, a ball of fear and violence before exploding. Anyone who survived the initial blast was unlucky enough to have seen the Shy Guy's face. Their screams rang out briefly before being abruptly silenced by the monster. Helicopter Alpha had no survivors. Meanwhile, Ricky and Elliot had kept running until their lungs burned and their muscles pumped thumbtacks. Seeing that the chaos was so far behind them now, they took a moment to stop and breathe, recomposing themselves. In the second minor miracle of the night, it looked like the 2 of them had actually survived this ordeal. Those 2 horrific monsters had canceled each other out, but Ricky and Elliot were about to learn a harsh lesson. They really weren't that lucky. The last thing the 2 of them ever saw was Siren Head emerging from the darkness once more. The last thing they ever felt was the monster's terrible gnarled fingers curling around their bodies, too fast for them to escape. And the last thing they ever heard was each other's screams, followed by a sickeningly meaty crunch. Elsewhere in the forest, SCP-096’s wails died down to its usual maudlin sob. The rage state had ended. All of its targets had been destroyed. It just hadn't been the one to do all of the destroying, per se. Not long after that, Helicopter Bravo descended safely, and the remaining MTF members closed around the blubbering beast. Someone blackbagged it, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that was at least one monster taken care of tonight. "What about the other one?" the MTF lieutenant asked. The team's commander shook his head and said, "Let's worry about that freak later and get 096 back to containment. This place gives me the creeps." It happened in 1981, in a small rural village in West Germany. Siegfried Geis, 9 years old, ran across the bitter snow, tears freezing to his cheeks. It was Christmas Day, and not long ago he'd been so happy. He was celebrating with his family, his mother, his father, and his young sister, the centers of his universe, when that monster had attacked and destroyed everything he'd ever known. The White Terror, the destroyer of Christmas cheer, the Yule Man, SCP-4666. Though of course, young Siegfried had no idea. In hindsight, Siegfried's parents had been noticing strange things in the lead-up to Christmas Day. Unfamiliar bumps and knocks, strange smells coming from the attic, the occasional tall, dark silhouette on the horizon outside their isolated old farmhouse. But in all the hustle and bustle of the season, nobody really paid the proper attention to all the signs of an incoming Weihnacht event. Every eerie feeling was just written off as stress or overactive imaginations. None of the Geis family knew about the true danger they were facing until they woke up to see the Yule Man standing over them, sharpening a rusty blade and staring at them with hungry, sadistic eyes.
Merry Christmas.
The creature rasped and chuckled. Siegfried was lucky to escape alive, but of course he would never see his family again. He'd be picked up a day or so later, traumatized, catatonic, and almost frozen to death. When he was finally able to speak again, he spoke of a monster having killed his family. When the police investigated his home and found the remains, they deemed it to be the work of an all-too-human serial killer, and poor Siegfried Geis was entered into the foster system. Years of work with psychiatric professionals tried to convince young Siegfried that the monster he claimed to see, the unnaturally tall, gnarled, bony freak with those shimmering black eyes, was merely a product of his trauma. But he knew the truth. He always knew. What he encountered that day, the thing that took his family, was nothing less than a true monster. And at 9 years old, Siegfried made a vow he would one day kill the monster, no matter what it took. When Siegfried was finally adopted and returned to school, he did everything he could to apply himself academically. He had no interest in friends or romantic relationships, even as he grew into his teenage years. The only thing that drew his interest, in addition to the perfection of his academic life, was his own private research into the supernatural. He became an expert in all things occultic and anomalous, sightings of ghosts, phantoms, aliens, and monsters. He wanted to know it all. No, needed to know it all. He would arm himself with knowledge, wanting to know everything he could in advance of the confrontation that would be his final destiny. He also began obsessively researching attacks similar to the ones that killed his family, and found an eerie pattern seemingly to unfold all over the Northern Hemisphere. During the 12 days of Christmas, entire families would be found dead in their homes, mutilated horrifically, often with children having gone completely missing. They happened far enough apart in terms of time and space that no connection was drawn between the events, all just random attacks according to the police and media. Weren't the connections obvious? He didn't understand it. It was almost like there was some kind of sweeping cover-up obscuring the true culprit behind all these killings. The same beast that destroyed his life. As Siegfried, now known to most as Dr. Geis, ascended through his time at university, he became one of Germany's foremost scholars on the occult, with several published papers and books that drew fascination of fellow experts and laymen alike. But most importantly of all, Siegfried's work got the attention of the SCP Foundation. They reached out to the ambitious rising star of the paranormal world and offered him a research position. Dr. Geis was elated and said that he would happily take the role if they answered one question for him. Did they know anything about a horrific humanoid monster that attacked families across the Northern Hemisphere around Christmas time? This was the moment when Dr. Siegfried Geis, after decades of searching, finally came to know about SCP-4666. He had access to all of the SCP Foundation's information on the monster, putting him several steps closer to what had always been his ultimate goal: killing that godforsaken thing. But this would be easier said than done. After all, if the Yule Man was easy to track, the Foundation would have captured and contained him long before now. His attacks could occur anywhere across the Northern Hemisphere, making catching him the world's largest game of whack-a-mole. But this was a game that Dr. Geis had more than enough patience to play. Over the following years, Dr. Geis worked as hard as humanly possible, not just at the case of SCP-4666, but at every piece of work the Foundation had to offer him. Much like his ruined childhood, Geis made no effort to interact, no effort to form social connections. He just worked and worked and worked and worked with single-minded passion, soon developing a reputation as one of the most hard-working and dependable figures in the SCP Foundation's European division. It was this kind of work ethic that soon saw him promoted to senior researcher, and then a site director. He had more control over information, resources, and manpower than ever before. It was almost time. He could sense it. Delegating other tasks to his subordinates, Dr. Geis began to work on his masterpiece, an advanced algorithm connecting police, social media, and surveillance databases across the Northern Hemisphere. You see, while Dr. Geis had never faltered in his quest, neither had the Yule Man. Every year, more families disappeared or were horrifically murdered, and every death weighed on Guys. He saw them as a personal failing of his inability to fulfill his destiny. But the Yule Man was a creature of habit, and it would be that very adherence to habit that Guys used to destroy it. Using the algorithm he created, they would perfectly track and triangulate the home most likely to be the subject of a dreaded Rematch event, with greater accuracy and precision than ever before. The year was 2022. Dr. Geist was convinced that this time, he would be the one to claim victory and vengeance. There was one thing he didn't tell his Foundation compatriots, though. As he put the pieces in place for the final showdown, he had no intention of containing the Yule Man. This time, he would destroy it. Using his newfound influence as a well-respected site director, he requested the transfer of a few high-profile anomalies, as well as the services of a crack mobile task force death squad. It was time. The Yule Man watched the house from a distance. He'd been observing for days, watching the nice, happy family within. What pleasure it would bring him to destroy them, and take what's left to his workshop for further fun. Tonight would be the night that he claimed them. They were all blissfully unaware, and lived in an isolated rural area where nobody but him would hear all the wonderful screaming. The second the lights went out inside the house, he would strike, and bring about some Christmas fear. When the last window went dark, the Yule Man drew a long, rusty blade out of his bag of tricks and approached the house. He crept in through one of the windows. Locks had never been a problem for him. This whole process had played out hundreds of times. He barely even needed to think about it now. He crept in past the presents around the Christmas tree, found the stairs and began to climb. He'd find them in their beds, one by one, and take his time, savoring the pain, savoring the fear. He went into the youngest one's bedroom first, his lips pulled back into a manic grin. There was the little boy, tucked in under his quilt, like a present waiting to be unwrapped. He grabbed the sheet with his long, gnarled fingers and pulled it back, only to see a plastic dummy underneath, with a stun grenade fixed to its chest. Before the Yule Man could even react, the stun grenade exploded into his face, blinding him with a sudden white light and ringing in his ancient ears. The next thing he heard was a rugged military voice yelling, "Squad Alpha, move in!" Seconds later, the upstairs landing was filled with mobile task force operatives with assault rifles. They aimed and opened fire into the Yule Man, peppering him with painful bullets. He wasn't used to his victims fighting back like this. Truthfully, it even caught him off guard. But sadly for those brave task force operatives, it would not be enough to kill him. The Yule Man gripped his rusty knife and lunged at Squad Alpha. Moments later, they were all dead, and the furious Yule Man was trudging back down the stairs. There had been no satisfaction in this slaughter. How had they caught him like this? Perhaps he'd go eat some of his servants in his workshop to make himself feel better. As he walked back across the living room, past the Christmas tree, past all the presents, the television flickered into life. Staring at him from the screen was the grinning face of Dr. Siegfried Geis, now 50 years old. And the most insane part was that the Yule Man somehow recognized him, the one who got away 41 years prior. "Hello, old friend. You're looking a little glum," Siegfried said on the screen. "I take it that you did not enjoy the surprise party I just threw for you. Don't worry, the night isn't over yet. After all, you haven't even opened your presents." With that, the presents under the tree, which were actually packed with C4 plastic explosives, detonated, leveling the entire house with the Yule Man still inside. The explosion could be heard for miles as a great pillar of smoke rose up into the air. Several hundred meters away, Dr. Siegfried Geis waited and watched, flanked by Foundation agents and more mobile task force soldiers, taking in the majesty of the explosion. Dr. Geis remained steely-eyed and watched the blaze. Somehow he knew that even that would not be enough to end the monster permanently. He nodded to the lieutenant he'd brought with him. "Squad out! Squad Bravo! Time to engage!" The man barked in response. The remaining agents and MTF operatives, armed with assault rifles and submachine guns, descended on the burning wreckage of the house. Moments later, a tall, dark figure, the Yule Man, injured but alive, crawled out of the blaze. Immediately, the team opened fire, giving the monster everything they had. But once again, everything was not enough. The creature pulled out 2 long, rusty knives and leaped into the fray, making short work of the Foundation brass. Soon enough, it stood alone on blood-stained snow, until it caught another bullet in the head. Dr. Siegfried Geis was standing there, the last one alive to face the Yule Man, leveling a revolver. The Yule Man scowled. Geis held his steely gaze. "We meet again, at long last," Siegfried said. "You killed my family. You've killed so many others. Tonight, it is your turn, Yule Man. This is your Wisnacht." Geis opened fire as the Yule Man charged towards him, taking each shot in stride. Even as the Yule Man closed the distance, Geis didn't flinch. His resolve was steely. It made the Yule Man feel confused and furious that he didn't detect an ounce of fear in this man. Even when he drove a knife into the site director's stomach, Siegfried dropped to his knees and collapsed as the Yule Man ripped the knife back out. His gun clattered to the ground. It had been a mortal blow, and still, he seemed unfazed.
Why aren't you afraid?
The Yule Man growled. Siegfried spat blood and said,
You took my family 41 years ago. Everything since then has just been killing time until I got to see them again. Where you're going, all you'll ever see are flames and torment.
The Yule Man, furious, stabbed Siegfried again, this time through the heart. The doctor was dying, his life's work having seemingly amounted to nothing. But with the last of his strength, he reached into his coat and pulled out something, a little gift he'd requested from one Dr. Alto Clef before putting his plan into action. Dr. Siegfried Geis lifted a photo of SCP-096 right in front of the Yule Man's eyes.
Merry Christmas,
he said with his last breath. The Yule Man was confused. A photograph? Was that it? Was that really this foolish little boy's trump card after all this time? What a waste. Then, without a moment's warning, SCP-096 barreled into the Yule Man, sending them both rolling across the snow. One of Siegfried's preparations was to have SCP-096's containment cube temporarily relocated to only a mile away from the ambush site, to avoid collateral damage. If everything else failed, then SCP-096 would be their Hail Mary pass, their finishing move. And it worked marvelously. As strong and evil as the Yule Man was, he'd been weakened by the night's battle, and the Shy Guy was an order of magnitude more powerful than his sadistic foe. The Yule Man screamed in horror as SCP-096 set upon him with claws and teeth. After hundreds of years inflicting it on others, the Yule Man had died in terror, and Dr. Siegfried Geis had died with a smile on his face. There's never a good day for a supervillain attack or a tense feud with your closest sibling, and for the mighty THOR, this day was turning out to be both. As the self-proclaimed strongest Avenger flung his body across the planet Earth using his trusty magical hammer, Mjolnir, the Asgardian steeled himself for yet another confrontation with his evil half-brother, Loki, the god of mischief. As per usual, Loki was terrorizing the humans of a random city, using his illusions to manifest imaginary dragons and other ferocious beasts. And what was also usual is Thor had no idea what his brother's motive or endgame was. All the God of Thunder knew was that this kind of trickery-dickery would not be stood for. While these terrible creatures weren't real, they were still very frightening to the Earthlings. Civilians were running around in every direction away from Loki, and this was causing all kinds of chaos and traffic disturbances. Regardless of what Loki's plan was, Thor knew that his brother had to be stopped before things escalated further. On Earth, humans needed to rely on vehicles to get around, and even the slightest inconvenience in transportation could lead to disaster. Thor touched down in the same city square where Loki was unleashing his horde of make-believe monsters, landing in a classically cool superhero way.
Hello, brother,
Thor proclaimed.
I don't suppose you'll be stopping this without a fight.
Loki smiled a mischievous smile and replied,
Ah, Thor, we meet again. And once again, you're wrong. I can stop this anytime I want.
Loki swiftly moved his hand through the air, casting a new spell to dismiss his diabolical decoys. The illusions dispersed naturally, and soon the two brothers were facing each other one-on-one.
See?
Loki chuckled. Thor was rightly confused by his brother's unpredictable actions. He pointed Mjolnir towards Loki in an accusatory manner.
No illusions, no sorcery. What are you really playing at, Loki? Said Thor.
And then Loki reached into his robes and produced an unusual cube-shaped object. As his good brother was all too aware, this particular cube was the latest in a long line of mysterious and powerful cubes that Loki had used for his various evil plans. Loki juggled the unknown cube from one hand to the other, then waved it in the air in front of Thor and began to laugh maniacally.
All I need to do is open this ancient box of mysteries, and I'll become completely unstoppable.
Don't you dare do it, Loki, Thor shouted. That sort of power will be misused in your hands.
That's precisely the point!
Loki continued to laugh, then reached for what appeared to be the lid of the cube. He grabbed the top of it and made a show of beginning to twist. This sent Thor's heroic instincts into high gear, and he threw Mjolnir at the cube, knocking it out of Loki's grasp. As the cube flew away from the grinning villain, Thor dove to retrieve it before his brother had the chance. He soon held the strange item in one hand while calling Mjolnir back to the other. As Thor stared at the cube, pondering its purpose, Loki stretched out his hands in desperation.
Oh, no, not my cube! If you open it now, my plan is doomed!
Loki pleaded. Thor responded with a laugh of his own.
Nice try, brother, but I'm going to open it.
And so the God of Thunder did. Thor popped the cube's lid and braced himself for whatever cosmic force was about to be released, but for some reason, nothing happened. Still curious, Thor took a cautious look inside. As it turned out, the only thing within this apparently non-magical cube was what appeared to be a fully developed photograph.
What in Odin's name is this?
Thor removed the image and held it close to his face. It appeared to depict an emaciated, pale humanoid with long, spindly limbs standing in the corner of a compact room with smooth metal walls. In all his many years traveling the 9 realms, Thor had never seen anything like it. Whatever the creature actually was, it certainly did not look happy. Of course, what Thor was actually looking at was a photo taken of SCP-096 inside of its containment unit at the Foundation. The Shy Guy, as its nickname suggested, did not like having its face looked at, even via secondary means, such as photography or video recording. The anomalous humanoid sense of shame about its own appearance was so great that a mere moment after Thor fixed his Asgardian eyes upon its visage, SCP-096 began to stir in its containment unit. The creature wailed and covered its face with both of its hands on its long, sinewy arms. It screamed and carried on for a duration of 2 minutes, after which point SCP-096 sprinted towards the steel walls of its containment unit and smashed through. Reaching speeds greater than most motor vehicles, SCP-096 began to zero in on Thor's location. As was always the case when another being saw its face, the Shy Guy was compelled to utterly annihilate the offending observer with its bare hands. Thor himself had no idea that SCP-096 was en route and continued to squint at the photograph, perplexed by the mysterious entity depicted therein. Loki now resumed his mad laughter because once more, he had managed to trick his foolish brother into falling for one of his ingenious schemes.
Make sure to get a good look, brother, Loki gloated. Yes, look at the faux creature. That will bring about your inevitable destruction.
Thor was annoyed.
If you think that showing me a gross picture of some lowly wretch will strike fear into my heart, you've truly forgotten what it means to be an Asgardian.
Save your sentiments for the halls of Valhalla, the green-clad evildoer cackled. You'll be there soon enough.
And with that, Loki used a charm to turn himself invisible and vanish completely from Thor's sight. Thor stomped his foot on the ground angrily. He wasn't sure how, but it seemed as though Loki had gotten the last laugh once again.
Loki!
He shouted after his brother.
Come back here and face me with honor!
Then the God of Thunder sighed pensively and thought to himself, who am I kidding? He's never going to change. Thor looked at his trusty hammer.
Mjolnir, old friend, it seems like we've saved the day yet again. Shall we away back to Avengers HQ?
He then shook Mjolnir up and down like a puppeteer, simulating a nod.
Splendid idea, Mjolnir. Glad you thought of it.
Thor chuckled, already in better spirits. That's when he began to hear the footsteps of SCP-096 rapidly approaching him. Thor turned his head towards the sound and saw the same disquieting creature from the photograph that was inside Loki's cube, zooming headlong towards him with reckless abandon. The Asgardian blinked. He almost couldn't believe his eyes. Whatever that thing was, it was faster than Thor could have possibly anticipated.
Was it looking for the photograph?
He wondered.
Hello there!
Thor called out as SCP-096 continued to make a beeline at the caped superhero. The god of thunder waved the photograph of SCP-096 in the air.
Is this your, selfie?
In all likelihood, Loki had been his usual conniving self and stole that self-portrait from the miserable creature, hoping that it would mistake Thor for the thief. The god of mischief had probably even used a glamour to disguise himself as Thor when he did the deed. Thor believed that all he had to do was clear up this misunderstanding, and that he and this strange beast could go their separate ways without coming to blows. It was a naive, optimistic, and ultimately incorrect view of the situation, but at least the hero's heart was in the right place.
I don't need this, so...
Thor said, trying to reason with the creature.
You can have it back if you'd like.
But SCP-096 showed no signs of stopping, and was seemingly enraged even further by Thor flaunting its decidedly unflattering photograph. The Shy Guy kicked the ground and shot forward with a powerful burst of speed. One of its elongated arms slammed into Thor's face with enough force to nearly knock the Asgardian off his feet. Thor was so surprised that he instinctively whacked the creature with Mjolnir, sending SCP-096 careening backwards down the street. It wasn't launched more than a dozen feet before its powerful arms and legs dug into the pavement and slowed its velocity to 0. Even though the thing from the photo had taken a direct hit from Mjolnir, it barely looked phased on a physical level. One thing was for sure, the Shy Guy was still incredibly distraught, and it was directing all of those negative emotions towards the god of thunder.
What was this thing? What is this thing?
Thor wondered to himself. It was fast, strong, and durable to an unearthly degree. If this thing wanted to engage in single combat, Thor wouldn't back down. He was an Asgardian warrior, and sometimes that meant facing challenges head-on, no matter how suddenly they arose. Still, his time with the Avengers had taught him that having a clear reason to fight was sometimes even more important than the fight itself.
Hey, quick question, what are you?
He said aloud to the creature. SCP-096 didn't answer. Within seconds, it was on Thor again like a bilg snipe on another bilg snipe. The screaming humanoid swung wildly, pelting its opponent with blow after blow. Thor tried once more to communicate with his unknown enemy.
I have no quarrel with you, Weird One,
Thor spoke.
So take your noodle arms and be gone.
For all of its relentless ferocity, the humanoid abomination left countless openings that a seasoned warrior like Thor could easily exploit. Of course, most mortal combatants would be unable to endure the brunt of the Shy Guy's attacks for long enough, but true to his nature, Thor was a god. The Avenger struck back with another crushing blow from Mjolnir, aimed straight for the creature's sternum. Once again, the monster was pushed back for a moment, and then resumed its maddening onslaught.
A blow like that should have at least busted a rib or two. Were the bones of this horrible thing made of vibranium or some other rare metal out of the depths of space?
Thor realized he was now fighting on the defensive. While he had faced foes in the past with much greater physical strength than the Shy Guy, including his superhero colleague Bruce Banner's mean, green, ever-loving alter ego, the Incredible Hulk, the sheer tenacity of SCP-096 meant that being careless with his own protection could lead to Thor taking unnecessary hits that would eventually wear him down in a prolonged fight. The wiry humanoid certainly didn't show any signs of slowing down or tiring, even though it had to be expending a lot of energy to move so quickly. Between his alternating deflections and counterblows against the creature, Thor mulled over his brother's words from earlier.
Loki was right about one thing. This is a fell creature if ever there was one. Still, as long as there is thunder in my blood, I won't allow a hairless cur like this to bring me my own destruction. Think, Thor, what would Stark do at a time like this? He says he's the smart one after all, humor him.
With his highly sophisticated tactical acumen that was similar to Iron Man except for the fact that it was much better and stronger, Thor efficiently assessed his current situation. While the pale beast was undoubtedly violent and far mightier than most terrestrial creatures, its attention and all the brute strength that came with it had been fixated solely on Thor since it arrived in the city. The Asgardian's best guess as to why was the photograph that Loki had tricked him into looking at. Devious trickster that he is, Loki must have known that this thing would hunt down and attempt to pulverize the latest being to see its face. which now, of course, happened to be Thor. The revelation of this fact meant that Thor no longer had to worry about the fate of civilians if he chose to relocate to a less populated battlefield, since the creature was now guaranteed to follow him. Nobody else needed to get hurt. While running from the fight wasn't exactly the God of Thunder's favorite strategy, it would massively reduce the chance of collateral damage. He'd be saving lives in classic Avengers fashion. Captain America would be so proud. Not that Thor would have done it any differently, even if he didn't have the Star-Spangled Man's approval. SCP-096 leaped in towards Thor to deliver its next walloping strike, but the Asgardian quickly grabbed it by the wrist and pulled the ferocious creature off its feet. He lifted it up and over his head before slamming it down hard into the pavement. With a bit of space between himself and his anomalous foe, Thor began to swing Mjolnir around by its leathery wrist strap. The Shy Guy desperately scrambled to its feet to resume the attack, but by that time, Thor had already thrown himself skyward. He soared between the buildings using the force of Mjolnir's trajectory, making it his mission to exit the city as soon as possible. Thor looked down to see that SCP-096 was following him along the ground, exactly as he predicted it would. While the battle with the beast would most certainly continue the second he dropped back to Earth's surface, he could rest assured that the place where the showdown would take place could be chosen by him. He saw an evergreen forest on a nearby mountain and decided that it would do nicely as a place to finish this. "I'm sure no one would mind a few stray bolts of lightning around here," Thor thought. The God of Thunder was amused by the prospect of going all out against this being. Even though it probably had its reasons for wanting to destroy the one that saw its face, Thor was past the point of taking chances on diplomacy. This distressing creature was, after all, an adversary that Loki had plotted to send after him through one means or another, and because of that, it was likely to have power and guile to spare. Thor breaking a sweat to vanquish the thing would be a fitting replacement for the fight that he would have to have with Loki. Thor's feet hit the ground on a stony mountain ledge, and once again he struck that iconic superhero landing pose. Remarkably, the Shy Guy had kept pace with Thor almost the entire time the Asgardian had been flying, smashing through every tree and boulder that stood in its path. Even so, Thor was more than ready for it. Storm clouds rumbled overhead. The sky above the mountain was trembling as Thor decided that it was time to bring down the thunder on his unfortunate foe. Boom! Crack! The heavens flashed with electrical might as Thor channeled the energy from several lightning bolts through Mjolnir, before unleashing a consolidated blast of unbridled power onto SCP-096. The Shy Guy didn't even attempt to dodge as Thor's Thundershock treatment bombarded it with light and heat, the likes of which few mortals could withstand. Thor released a second blast, then a third, surrounding SCP-096 with as much lightning as these earthly skies would offer him. After keeping at this for a while, Thor decided to let up momentarily to check in on his foe, only to see that there were no signs of visible damage on the creature. It wasn't even slightly singed. The God of Thunder could feel his brother laughing at him from somewhere out of sight and out of reach. The monstrous humanoid in the forest below was proving to be far more than Thor had bargained for, but he was nowhere near ready to give in and accept defeat. Still, maybe this wasn't a fight worth having on Earth. All Thor's electrical attacks were doing was destroying trees, and the planet was already facing unprecedented levels of deforestation due to the greed of human CEOs and shady entrepreneurs. Thor certainly didn't want to be part of the problem, and now that it was occurring to him, he realized that he should probably try to do something about that once the situation with the Shy Guy was resolved. It didn't matter how close of a friend Elon Musk was to Tony Stark. These overreaching humans had to be given a stern talking to by the God of Thunder, with or without hammer in his hand. Of course, Thor's environmentalist concerns had to go on the back burner for now, since SCP-096 was advancing towards him once again, with no hint of slowing down. "Let's see if you can follow me back to Asgard, you son of an elf," Thor thought. He held his hammer aloft and counted on Heimdall to deploy the Bifrost. The Rainbow Bridge arrived seconds before SCP-096's arms would have reached the Asgardian, and as expected, it instantly carried Thor into the interdimensional space between his destinations. Amidst the swirling sea of multicolored lights, Thor shared a laugh with nobody but himself and Mjolnir. "So much for Shy Guy," said Thor. "Looks like it'll have to resolve those body issues on its own time. I've been through something similar, so I can relate. Best of luck, pitiful beast." But while Thor was congratulating himself for his strategic retreat, he almost didn't notice that his foe hadn't actually stopped in its pursuit. As a matter of fact, SCP-096 was currently inside of the Bifrost and swiftly gaining on the God of Thunder. The Shy Guy was truly running in the 90s. Well, 90 miles per hour or more, but it made the same difference. The creature grabbed Thor by his ankles and screeched in mortified rage. Thor punched SCP-096 in the face, hoping to shake it off, but to no avail. The two opponents spun through the Bifrost, locked together in an unbreakable grapple, until they collided with the walls of interdimensional space. Thor knew exactly where this was going, and he wasn't happy about it. Like a sheet of ice composed of photons, the outer limits of the Bifrost broke away, sending both combatants shooting off into the void. Seconds later, a wormhole spit Thor and SCP-096 out in a vast junkyard filled with the remains of countless spaceships and alien life forms.
Great, I'm trapped in this garbage world again. I knew I should have picked somewhere closer.
Thor shook off the nauseating effects of the failed interdimensional trip. SCP-096 was already hale and hearty for another round. Thor grimaced with frustrated anticipation.
How about a quick 5-minute rest?
Thor implored the Shy Guy.
Gentlemen's truce?
SCP-096 roared and dashed forth, more crazed than ever. Thor exhaled in futility.
I thought not.
He whipped Mjolnir around and hurled it straight for SCP-096's skull. The reliable Urus steel hammer made contact, knocking the creature onto its back. At the very least, Thor could always count on his signature weapon to help him out. Or could he? When the Asgardian tried to call the hammer back, he was shocked to find that SCP-096 had somehow grabbed a hold of its handle. Even more surprisingly, it now appeared to be wielding the hammer as easily as Thor could.
Son of a… You're telling me that thing is worthy?
The Shy Guy, now with Mjolnir in hand, pounced on Thor, swinging the hammer with no technique or finesse. It was everything Thor could do to simply avoid the creature's range. A blow from Mjolnir was enough to cause serious injury to even the most formidable Asgardian warrior.
Damn you, Mjolnir, we talked about this,
Thor thundered.
We're friends, aren't we?
But none of his words could get through to the hammer now that it was in the hand of SCP-096. In an act of righteous defiance, Thor called the fury of lightning into his own body. This strange foe, which had come from Loki's latest prank, was about to find out what happened when a god of thunder got serious. With the speed of a lightning bolt, Thor flew at SCP-096 and punched it so hard that its grip loosened on Mjolnir for all but a second, and that second was all Thor needed to reclaim his weapon. His hand clung tightly to Mjolnir's handle as he swung the weapon into the Shy Guy's body with all of his might. The shockwave of this forceful blow launched piles of debris high into the air and sent SCP-096 tumbling across the surface of the planet like a thrown piece of discarded food at an Asgardian feast. With another pulse of electricity, Thor magnetized the portions of the rubble which contained spaceship parts and used his manipulation of that same energy to bury the Shy Guy in the deepest heap of trash he could manage. And with one last flick of Mjolnir, Thor sent himself hurtling through the largest wormhole in the sky above and back into space where it would be far more difficult for his foe to follow him. Finally, with some distance, Thor breathed a sigh of relief.
You almost had me that time, Loki. What an unusual being. Fought like a berserker, but was somehow also pure of heart. A kindred spirit to myself, perhaps? Even so, I truly hope to never meet that thing again.
Everyone in the sleepy mountain town had heard stories about the abandoned mall and the malevolent creature that lurked in the wreckage there. There had been enough missing persons cases, lost children, teenagers sneaking out to explore and never returning home, urban explorers who stumbled out of the darkness disheveled and traumatized. With an eyewitness account, no one wanted to believe. There wasn't anyone left in the surrounding area willing to set foot in that cursed place. But that didn't stop opportunistic out-of-towners from paying the occasional visit, especially if they felt like there was money to be made in those crumbling corporate walls. Grant and Jason, the hosts of up-and-coming investigative reality show Ghostly Happenings, were two such visitors. When they heard the rumors about an abandoned mall haunted by some sort of dark presence blamed for the disappearance of local children, they packed up their van, picked up their underpaid cameraman Derek, and headed straight for the infamous building.
Are you sure we're allowed to be here?
Derek asked shakily as he began filming.
Nope,
Grant answered cheerfully.
that's part of the fun.
Jason laughed.
Look, man, this place has been left to rot by the city. No one cares if we're shooting some footage. Besides, worry less about the cops and more about the ghost of the mall. Grant grinned. Ooh, not funny, Derek grumbled. Come on, serious faces, we're rolling. Jason nudged his co-host, and the two snapped into their on-camera personalities. Once a bustling center of suburban American life, this shopping mall has transformed into a den of terror. Grant's voice dropped into a lower register, his expression intense. Locals swap stories of something inhuman that calls this place home. Something that doesn't take kindly to trespassers, Jason added. A ghost? A demon? Just an urban legend? That's what we're here to find out. Grant pulled out an EMF reader, which began beeping as he turned it on. There seems to be a lot of activity in here already. I'm picking up something. Don't know if you folks at home can see this, but the meter's going crazy, Jason exclaimed. It was a fake meter, of course. One that they rigged up to beep and react when Grant pressed certain hidden buttons. But the audience didn't need to know that. They were tuning in for story, for spectacle, not for the truth. If they wanted that, they could flip over to the Nature Channel and watch some lions chasing a gazelle. On this show, they were chasing pure entertainment. They continued deeper into the building, taking in the massive echoey space, the dusty storefronts, the beams of rotten wood strewn across the ground, the rats that skittered across the floor. It was the perfect creepy atmosphere. Maybe a little too perfect, a little too creepy. What was that? Derek practically jumped out of his skin, spinning around to look at something behind him. Hey, stay on us, Grant snapped. I saw something moving back there, Derek insisted. It was a rat, Jason rolled his eyes. There are tons of them in here. Derek shook his head. No, it wasn't a rat, it was way too big. Okay, a raccoon then, come on, get it together. We've been in way worse locations than this. Remember that old tuberculosis hospital? Grant shuddered. God, no, that was scary. This is nothing. Well, not nothing. Jason elbowed his partner. I did a good job scouting this place, right? Grant was about to answer when his foot bumped something on the ground. He looked down and saw a Polaroid camera next to a long, empty water bottle and a small backpack. Oh man, get a shot of this! Derek obliged while Jason took a closer look. This must have belonged to one of the urban explorer types who came in here. He unzipped the backpack, rummaging around. Hey, look, photos! Tons of them! He dumped the pictures out onto the ground. Think he got some spirit photography done before he bit the dust? Well, might as well see. Grant joined Jason on the ground, sifting through the photos as Derek watched anxiously. Boring, deer, dog, sunset. Oh, wait a minute. He stopped, holding up one specific Polaroid. This is the money shot right here. Derek, zoom in on this. All three men looked at the picture, illuminated by the camera's light. It showed a tall, long-limbed, pale creature, vaguely humanoid in shape, but at the same time distinctly not quite human. Its mouth was stretched wide in a wordless screech, its eyes bloodshot and wild. Its long, tapered fingers were reaching towards the camera. Damn, that's spooky, Jason laughed, a bit of nervousness creeping into his voice. How do you think he set this up? Grant asked. What if it's real? Derek swallowed the lump in his throat. Don't be an idiot, Grant scoffed. But then, from the outside, not 100 feet away, they heard a scream, ear-splittingly loud, filled with rage, pain, and animalistic instinct. It was like nothing any of them had ever heard before. The scream was followed by the sound of splitting wood, branches crashing to the ground, and horrifyingly, the sound of something breaking down a nearby wall. What did you do? Jason backed away from the sound. Me? You opened the backpack? Grant shot back. Guys, I think we need to get out of here. Derek watched in wide-eyed terror as two pale hands ripped a hole in the wall in front of them, making an opening for that pale, hairless head from the photograph to poke through. All three men prepared to make a break for it and run for their lives, but as soon as the creature saw them, it was already too late. With another scream, SCP-096 sprinted toward them, grabbing each man and throwing them to the ground. The camera shattered into pieces from the impact, and Derek skidded painfully across the ground. As he rolled onto his side to try and push back up to his feet, he caught a glimpse of the monster opening its mouth impossibly wide and descending on his bosses. He really didn't want to focus on what happened next, but suffice to say there was nothing of them left afterwards. Derek tried his best to escape, but he was no match for the brute strength and speed of SCP-096. From the moment he saw its face,
His fate was sealed. There was no escape. Soon the beeping EMF meter, the scattered photographs, and the broken pieces of the camera were the only thing left of the crew from ghostly happenings. Their devoted fans would never get another episode, but at least one being in the abandoned mall could rest easy now. SCP-096 was safe again. No one was living who had seen its face. It slowly crawled back to the hole it had made in the wall, ready to return to the forest and climb back up the mountain. There it could curl up beneath a tree and stay there for as long as it wanted. But as SCP-096 reached the hole in the wall, where it had once been able to see night sky, stars, and the trees in the distance, there was only blackness. It was as if something dark was stretching over the opening, blocking the outside world from view. 096 reached out a hand to push the blockage out of the way, but whatever it was, slithered away from the touch faster than the pale hand could move. The wriggling darkness crept back into the building, weaving in and out of the shadows as SCP-096 watched it curiously. Whatever it was, it hadn't looked at the creature's face yet. It wasn't sure if this thing even had eyes. But then, stretching out of the darkness and into view, was a garish face with wide white eyes with massive pupils, a round nose, and a wide mouth stretched into a toothy grimace that might have once looked like a smile. This was the creature that had made the mall its home, the apex predator of this biosphere, and it was staring directly at SCP-096's face. Its face. With a shriek, 096 flew into a primal rage, clawing at the cat-like creature, but before 096 could reach it, the thing was gone. Where was it? Where did it go? 096 roared, tearing at the floor, ripping up the tile and gouging long, deep scratches in the concrete beneath. A sound in the distance drew 096's attention, and it bolted in the direction of the noise, swinging at any obstacle in its path as it went. It ripped down a banner advertising free frozen yogurt samples, crushed an empty cell phone kiosk, and threw a gumball machine to the floor with a crash. It would rip the entire mall apart if it had to, if that was what it took to destroy the being that had caught a glimpse of its face and disappeared. Then, 096 could see it. That face. That wide-eyed, grinning face. It sprinted toward the face as fast as it could. The cartoon cat was looking at 096, not from a place in the room, but from behind the screen of a television in the electronics store window. Somehow defying the laws of physics and reality, it had made its way into the TV. 096 didn't pause to ponder the logic of this. There was no room for critical thought. There was only the need to shred, to consume, to destroy. It burst through the window, sending shards of glass in every direction, and reared back to attack the screen. It was so focused on its singular task that it didn't notice the long black arms snaking across the floor, winding around its feet. All of a sudden, 096 lost its balance as its legs were pulled right out from under it, those stretchy arms dragging it into the TV screen itself. When 096 regained consciousness, it was in a place it did not recognize. Gone was the inside of the mall or the familiar forest and mountains outside. Instead, SCP-096 was in some sort of hand-drawn world. A massive house with a hallway that seemed to go on forever, lined with infinite doors leading to who knew where. The floor tipped and tilted at odd angles, and the geometry made no three-dimensional sense. It was dizzying and deeply off-putting. SCP-096 had no frame of reference to compare it to, but a human witness might have noticed that this place looked like something out of an old cartoon, from the days of Steamboat Willie and the like. SCP-096 did not think such a thing. It only knew that it was in an unfamiliar place, one that felt threatening, though there were no visible threats, and it knew that it still hadn't gotten its hands on the creature that had seen its face. All along the walls between each door, there were clocks in the shape of that horrible cat, eyes ticking back and forth with each second, wide smile mocking SCP-096 as if to say, "Try and find me." SCP-096 would not be discouraged. There was no room in its mind for that sort of thing. There was only the singular goal of finding the cartoon cat and tearing it limb from rubber hose limb. Psychological warfare would have no effect. Still, Cartoon Cat would give it his best shot. This was his world, and he could do whatever he wanted here. Cartoon Cat poked his head out through a random doorway, waving to 096 with one of his puffy white-gloved hands. As 096 wailed and began to give chase, Cartoon Cat slammed the door shut, only to open another door down the hall and poke his head out of that one. He did the same trick over and over, jerking SCP-096 around from end to end of the ever-expanding animated hallway. After some time passed, however, it appeared SCP-096 was not going to get tired, and was not going to give up hope of catching its prey. It was time to end this. Cartoon Cat wrapped one long arm around SCP-096's neck, restraining it against the wall, and began to squeeze tighter and tighter. But nothing happened. SCP-096 did not collapse, did not react at all except to tear at the arm around its neck until it broke free. Then it returned to the relentless pursuit, tearing door frames apart, pulling up floorboards, punching through walls. Every time it dealt damage to the environment, the space filled itself back in, an unseen pen scribbling in the gaps in the floorboards, sealing up the holes in the walls. Two powerful beings going back and forth, locked in a seemingly equal-matched battle. Cartoon Cat tried to destroy SCP-096 in a myriad of ways. He tried to rip the beast apart, to snap its neck, to do any manner of unspeakable violent acts it had done before with great sadistic glee. But this pale abomination would not fold, would not break. This wasn't going to be any fun if there was no ending, and if 096 kept destroying one of Cartoon Cat's favorite pocket worlds, that was quite enough. Cartoon Cat grabbed hold of 096's arms and legs, the creature thrashing viciously as he did so, and threw it into the blank space just beyond the illustrated world. Back in the mall, SCP-096 crashed back to Earth. It was about to resume its search for Cartoon Cat when suddenly a bright light illuminated its face. A police officer stood a few feet away, holding a flashlight.
"Excuse me, you can't be in here. You're trespassing," the officer started to warn, but his words were interrupted when 096 began to scream. Soon, he would be screaming too. Now go and check out SCP-049 Cures SCP-096 of the Pestilence and SCP-096 vs. Siren Head for more Shy Guy crossovers you won't be afraid to look at.